much indeed. And may I sort of apologise to the committee, but I was attending a funeral for a well-known and a much beloved member of our association in South Antrim, and I apologise for being adrift for that. But as we can crack on, moving on to the public session. Apologies.
It's Chair's business.
Oh, so Chair business. Sorry, my fault. Chairperson's business. I just say we had an informal meeting. The Deputy Chairperson and I met informally with the Minister on Monday to discuss the statement on October monitoring. The Department will brief in detail on the statement next week. Is the committee content to note?
Noted.
Noted, thank you. Assembly Connects business. The Chairperson was invited to attend an Assembly Connects business dinner on Wednesday the 10th of November 2021. Didn't say it was dinner.
Oh, there's dinner included, yes.
Unfortunately, I'm not available. In the Great Hall hosted by the Speaker. I'm unavailable. Is the committee content for me, is the committee content for me to ask the Deputy Chairperson to attend in my absence? Excellent, thank you. Okay, that's agreed. Draft minutes of proceedings. The draft minutes of the Finance Committee meeting the 20th October are at page 7. Are members content that the draft minutes of the 20th October are an accurate record of proceedings? Is this agreed? Agreed. Just before I go any further, congratulations, Philip, on your cycling all the way to Glasgow. It's
Well, did I take back all my criticism?
Yeah, a few years ago, I did something similar on a charity bike ride, and it was particularly arduous going up up those hills outside Glasgow.
Well, Mr.
But
Chairman,
well done.
I accused him of getting a private jet, and he didn't refute that. So I'm pleased to hear he went by cycle.
Very modest. I was going to try a chair on the rickshaw, but I was run off my feet. So I'll give it up. Sorry about that.
But well done, Philip, and thank you very much indeed. Okay, there are no matters arising. Is this agreed? Agreed. Okay.
We do the minutes there, yeah.
Sorry, I did. Sorry, let me just check. Minutes of proceeding. Yes, I did. We did.
Sorry,
agreed.
sorry, Chair.
Yep. Right. Can I remove the members from the spotlight and add the witnesses to the spotlight? And I think we've got the witnesses in
person. Yes, I believe we do.
Yeah. Can we bring sort of Ian and Sharon in, please? Team, we're going to hear receive oral and written briefing from the Department on the non-domestic rates coronavirus valuation bill. Our clerk's briefing paper is page 17. The Department's pre-introduction paper of the bill is page 25. The Departmental correspondence on the recovery arrangements for COVID-19 grant overpayments and rates holiday awards made in errors at page 44. Previous related papers are at page 52. The Westminster Scottish legislations are at page 75 and page 101. The evidence session has been reported by Hansard. Hi Ian, hi Sharon, good to see you again. Actually, good to see you actually here. I normally see you here, Ian, and the rest of it. Let me know, Ian, when you're ready to go, and then we can crack on.
Okay, just give me a second. I have an opening statement here. It's reasonably lengthy. It might take about 5 to 10 minutes to get through, but there's some stuff in it which I think is quite important to get through, just to explain the background to this issue.
Okay, Ian, over to you.
Just to load up.
I have it in hard copy here.
Yeah, do you have it? Yeah, I'll take that then. Thank you. Okay, thank you for the opportunity then to brief the committee on the bill which the Department is intending to bring forward, called the Non-Domestic Rates Valuations Coronavirus Bill. The effect of the bill, if it's passed, will be to remove the impact of the coronavirus pandemic as a grounds for challenging non-domestic rating valuations. So I need to explain a little bit of the context and background information on the non-domestic rating system to help explain why the Department considers it's necessary for this bill to be brought forward. A key feature of the system is that non-domestic properties are valued for rates on the basis of their net annual value, or NAV. That reflects the annual rent that the property would be expected to achieve in the market. So the NAV of every property is recorded in the non-domestic valuation list. That's published by the Commissioner of Valuations for Northern Ireland. Now, the rate bill for each individual property then is calculated by adding together the regional rate and the district rate to create a single rate poundage, and then you can bind those two together and multiply that by the NAV, and that produces the rates bill. So if you had an NAV of £10,000 The regional rate is 28p in the pound, the district rate is 25p in the pound. That combines to give you 53p. Your rates bill will be 5,300. That's how it works. So because NAVs are supposed to reflect the market rents, then the valuation list needs to be updated periodically to make sure that changes in the property market are factored into valuations and then ultimately into the rate bills that people pay. The valuation list is updated through general non-domestic revaluations, which are undertaken by Land and Property Services, and the most recent one of those revaluation exercises took effect on the 1st of April 2020.
Yeah.
So in a non-domestic revaluation, the NAVs of all the properties are assessed at the same date, called the antecedent valuation date. The use of that common date is important because it ensures every property is taxed on the same basis, and therefore there is fairness in the system. Because revaluations are quite complex exercises, they take some time to complete. There's typically a 2-year gap between that antecedent valuation date and the date of publication. So the antecedent valuation date for the current list was the 1st of April 2018, and then it was published on the 1st of April 2020. After the publication of the list, there's a 3-stage appeals process by which ratepayers can challenge the NAVs in the new list. So stage 1, you apply to the district valuer, then you appeal to the commissioner valuation, and then you can appeal to the lands tribunal. Any change in the NAV that results from that appeals process then gets backdated to the start of the valuation list. So it will be backdated until the 1st of April 2020. So it's an important point, I think, to explain now that the outcome of an individual challenge doesn't just affect that one property. So in order to maintain fairness between ratepayers, which is what the purpose of the revaluation is to achieve, the implications of the outcome of any one challenge then has to be considered in terms of how it might affect similar properties. So you look at what's called the tone of the list for that category of property, and then you see how the impact of that one challenge affects others. So for example, if you have a challenge on the NAV of a shop, we also need to look at the impact on other shops in the same street or the same shopping development, or what the impact might be in other shops in the same town or indeed in other towns elsewhere. So there's a wider impact from each challenge. Now, typically because there's this 2-year gap between the antecedent valuation date and the date of publication, things will happen which might affect the property market. For example, you can have an economic boom in some sectors, you can have a recession, there might be a local economic shock because of a factory closing in a particular town. Now, even if it was possible in practice, trying to take account of every shift in the property market between the antecedent valuation date and the publication date would be very disruptive to the preparation of the list, and also very disruptive for the planning of rates revenues by councils and the executive. So in order to maintain the transparency of the tax and also the certainty for ratepayers and for councils and the executive, any economic changes that happen between the antecedent valuation date and the date of publication aren't taken into account in the NAVs whenever they're published. Economic changes are dealt with at the next revaluation, and that's one of the reasons why frequent revaluations are important. However, having said that, the net annual value of a property can be affected by physical changes to the property. So there's a distinction there between physical changes and economic changes. So if something happens physically between the antecedent valuation date and the date of the publication, then that has to be reflected in the published valuation. And that's specified by Article 39A(1)(a) of the Rates Order. Now, whenever that was added to the rating legislation, the intention there was that if something happened which affected a property at a local level or an individual property, then what you would do would take that into account before the list was published. So, for example, the Primark fire is an example of the kind of situation where an event happens, it's localised, it affects certain properties, those properties have their access or whatever affected by that event. You ought to take that into account whenever the list is being published. So what was not envisaged, however, when Article 39A was added into the rating legislation was an event which would affect every single property in Northern Ireland simultaneously. So the coronavirus pandemic, or more specifically the restrictions on businesses which were put in place by the executive to control the pandemic, is something which has had an impact on all properties, but also then affects the physical enjoyment of those properties. So what we're intending with this bill is dealing with the unintended consequences of that unexpected confluence of events. So just to give a little bit more detail about what that means in practice and the specifics of what happens. The Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Regulations of 2020 first came into effect at 11 p.m. on Saturday, the 28th of March 2020, which was exactly 73 hours before the evaluation list was due to come into effect. Those regulations specified businesses that were either required to close completely or which were required to restrict how they operated in practice. Now, what we have had confirmed after extensive legal consultations is that those restrictions do constitute the kinds of matters which come under the ambit of Article 39A of the rating order. In particular...
Ian, has that been tested in Northern Ireland, or was this based on what was across in England?
Well, we've had two separate legal opinions on this matter and taken extensive consultations on it and sort of picked that through quite significantly. They've done separate work to that effect in England and Scotland, and all have come to more or less the same conclusion.
Okay.
Although the work in England and Scotland is based on different legislation, which is not exactly the same in its specifics, but the basic principles apply.
But it has been tested, and the legal opinion is there that it does apply.
Yes, two opinions on it. So, in particular, businesses that weren't allowed to open, they engage Part A of that article, which refers to matters affecting the physical state, or this is the important bit, physical enjoyment of the hereditament. So, if you're not allowed to open your business, then obviously that affects your physical enjoyment of it. Other businesses were allowed to continue to operate, but they were obviously affected by the general economic impact of other businesses being required to shut. So they're engaging Part D of Article 39A, which refers to matters affecting the use or occupation of other premises situated in the locality of the hereditament. So if you're a cafe, for example, which is allowed to remain open, and every other business around you is shut, clearly you are affected by what's going on in the locality. Now, the consequence of that is, in legal terms, the impact of those restrictions ought to have been taken into account on all 74,000 of the NAVs in the valuation list. Now, when I say taken into account, you can't assume that every single one would have been changed, but you would have had to have reviewed all 74,000 before the list was published on the 1st of April. Now, legally speaking, because that wasn't done, ratepayers may now challenge their NAVs and seek to get them reduced to take account of the impact of the coronavirus and the restrictions. And then, because we need to consider the implications of the outcome of any individual appeal for similar properties, then the impact on the valuation list could be consequentially quite extensive. A lot of properties could be affected. We've had 4,260 challenges lodged so far with the department out of 74,000 valuations, but you can't assume that only 4,200 properties are potentially at risk here. It could run into tens of thousands.
And how does that normally compare with challenges?
Last time, Sharon would know that's 7,000 roughly.
Yeah, the 2015 revaluation in the first year after that list was published, we had closer to 5,000 challenges. So the number isn't far off, but actually we would have expected a bigger influx of challenges in the first year, but it was mitigated this time because so many people had rate holidays that their rate bill just didn't factor, something that they wanted to work on.
Okay, so because rate bills are based on NAVs, a reduction in the NAV also produces a reduction in your rates bill. And because the change to the NAV is backdated to the start of the valuation list, that typically produces a refund to a ratepayer who's been overcharged, in effect, because the NAV has now been reduced. So around 4,200 applications made challenging NAVs. Majority of these include some reference to the impact of the pandemic amongst the grounds for the challenge. Now, whenever you work all of those cases through and you apply the potential impacts across the whole of the valuation list, a realistic estimate of the amount of revenue that could be lost because of refunds would be between 196 and 255 million pounds in total.
Say that again, just again, 196.
And 255 million pounds, and that covers 3 years between the 1st of April 2020 and the 31st of March 2023. Now, obviously there are a number of assumptions behind those calculations, which we can get into more detail if you want. But that includes an assumption that there will be a new valuation list taking effect on the 1st of April 2023 from the valuation exercise which is currently underway. Now, that loss has to be shared between the executive and district councils. Approximately 55% falls to the executive and 45% to district councils. The impact on the executive will be quite difficult to manage in the current budgetary situation, but I think it's fair to say it would be pretty devastating for most of the councils because they depend on the rates to provide about 75% of their income. And in some cases, I think the amounts of the refunds might be close to the total annual business rates take for an individual council. So, after taking extensive legal advice and considering the alternatives, the Department considers that new primary legislation is required to mitigate that loss to the non-domestic rates revenue, which arises from the timing of the coronavirus health measures in March last year. And just to explain, if the measures in the coronavirus restrictions have come into effect on the 1st of April, this issue simply wouldn't arise. So we were talking margins of days, which has caused this to happen. So what we're proposing to do is bring forward a bill to remove the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic and the associated health protection restrictions as valid grounds for challenging an NAV. So it will do that by providing that the matters mentioned in Article 39A of the rates order are to be treated as not including and never having had included any matter directly or indirectly attributable to the coronavirus. Now, as I mentioned already, the committee is aware that the Minister has announced a further non-domestic revaluation is being undertaken. Antecedent valuation date for that is the 1st of October of this year. The effective date will be the 1st of April 2023. So the bill includes also a future-proofing mechanism to ensure that if there are more restrictions relating to COVID or related pandemic in 2023, this same problem can't happen again. So we're future-proofing the regulations to make, or the legislation to make sure that doesn't happen. It's important to be very clear what this bill will not do. It will not restrict in any way any ratepayers' right to challenge their NAV on any other ground.
Just on the grounds of COVID?
Just on the grounds of COVID. All other applications and appeal are continuing to be processed as normal. We're also asking for accelerated passage procedure to ensure the bill is passed before the end of this mandate. In one sense, because this is a retrospective acting piece of legislation, it's quite unusual in that sense. It could, in theory, be passed in the next mandate and still have the same effect. However, we need to create some kind of certainty around the rates base for councils in their rate setting process. If I was a finance director of a local authority at this point in time and this risk existed, I think I would be setting a higher rate in order to make sure I had money to cover the costs of this. So I would be trying to defray or mitigate the uncertainty around that. So again, that has got negative consequences for businesses who are going to be then hit by higher rates bills than they would be if this bill was passed. And I can confirm the Attorney General has confirmed that the bill is within the legislative competence of the Assembly. So comparing the position with England, Scotland and Wales, as I mentioned earlier, the specifics of the rating legislation are different from ours, but all four jurisdictions face the same problem of COVID-related challenges to rateable values and a potentially large loss of revenue as a consequence. So the administrations in England, Scotland and Wales have all determined that a legislative solution is the only viable option for dealing with the issue. And therefore, similar legislation is going to be brought forward in those other jurisdictions. The UK government has introduced primary legislation covering England to prevent challenges to rateable values being brought forward on COVID-related health restrictions grounds. Welsh Assembly government has agreed that English legislation should be extended to cover Wales. And the Scottish government is bringing forward its own legislation to cover Scotland, having effectively the same impact as our proposal. The UK government has announced a supplementary £1.5 billion rates relief package to accompany the legislation when it's brought in. So, by way of compensation for removing the right to challenge an evaluation on this particular grounds, then this rate relief package has been introduced.
What would our take be on that one?
45 to 50 million.
50 million.
Access to that funding from that rate relief package will be conditional on successful passage of the legislation with Westminster. So if the legislation is not passed, then the funding doesn't become available. And if it doesn't become available in England, then obviously it's not available here.
But it has to go across all the nations as well before that funding becomes available, or is it just in England? Just in England,
but the Barnett consequential flows from the English measure. The intention in England is that the relief will be administered by local authorities and there'll be an application-based process, and it will exclude from the scope of that relief package any businesses which have benefited from an NAV-related relief up to this point or an NAV-related grant up to this point. Now, It's our intention to ring-fence any associated Barnett consequential funding to ensure it can be allocated to business ratepayers in the 2022-23 financial year, so next year. As I said, the value of that's in the region of £45 to £50 million. The mechanism for distributing the funding here hasn't been decided, though I can say at this point it's highly unlikely we'll follow the English approach, because we have given 29,000 businesses rate relief on the 12 months rates holiday. Every business received 4 months rates holiday last year, and tens of thousands of businesses received one or other of the business support grants, which are based on their NAV. So by quick calculation, I worked out that somewhere between 38 and 40,000 businesses have received one of these grants or rates reliefs, one or other, which would then exclude them from the rate relief in the English scheme, which I don't think is viable or sustainable in our situation. It's not right for our context. So we'll be designing our own approach to that. Obviously, be advising the committee further on what that will look like. While £45 to £50 million might not seem a huge amount when you put it against other measures that have been undertaken, we need to consider this compensation package is not the only thing which has been done to assist businesses during the pandemic. Other measures that we've put in place are the 12.5% real terms reduction in the non-domestic regional rate that was introduced last year, and that's been carried forward in a freeze in the current financial year. That's worth around £38 to £40 million per year in a reduced rate burden for businesses. We had the 4 months rates free period for all businesses between April and July 2020. And we have had the extended 24 months rates holiday for targeted sectors being identified as being in the greatest need, and that's supported 29,000 businesses who've paid no rates at all for 2 years. So the rates relief measures, those last two, have been worth more than £515 million over the past 2 years, and that's in addition to the £695 million worth of grants that LPS has administered since March of last year. So just briefly in conclusion, the draft bill is the Department's response to an unprecedented and unforeseeable set of events that has had quite complex legal consequences, which are likely to lead to very large losses of revenue, which will roll out over a long number of years for both executive and district councils. The Minister shares the view taken by ministers in Britain that the revenue losses within the business rate system, which would occur as a result of those COVID-19 related challenges, bearing in mind the unprecedented levels of support provided to business ratepayers over the past 2 years, would be unsustainable, wouldn't be justifiable, and of course would be contrary to the public interest, and the loss would be particularly severe for local authorities here. As in Britain, we have determined that the only viable option available to us to effectively deal with the risks is to introduce primary legislation to remove coronavirus and the associated restrictions from the coronavirus as valid grounds for appeal against NAVs in the 2020 valuation list. We're happy to take any questions the Executive might have.
In any previous sort of legislation, and when we were looking at sort of how we were looking at that, was there anything about force majeure was in the regulations that said for any other sort of event that came through it, or has it never been the case that something has been based on at this scale?
I don't know if there's any reference to force majeure in the written.
No, there isn't. And this is certainly the first time we've had anything on this scale, so widespread.
Yeah.
We've never faced anything like this before, and the rates order certainly isn't designed to deal with. And
the intent for this is the way this will be written will be specifically referring to COVID, not to anything else?
Yes, so it'll be, I think it refers to SARS-CoV-2 and related or similar or related pandemics and viruses.
So basically pandemics is...
Yeah, well, it's coronavirus pandemics particularly.
Okay. Sort of part of the Westminster legislation, I think, that came through was considered by, I think it was the Department of the Economy in May. So why, since the Department of Economy looked at parts of it in May, are we coming to us now? Why wasn't it being considered then?
The Westminster legislation covers two things. So it covers this rating aspect. It also covers the disqualification of directors from companies during the course of the pandemic. So,
and that was the relief because you couldn't do the accounts within a period of time because of COVID. Yeah.
Yes. So Department for the Economy has responsibility for the insolvency service and other matters relating to the disqualification of directors. So they took forward that part of the legislation. We were looking at the rates elements to it. So the Department of Economy would never have taken forward that particular part of the legislation. Now, we have been looking at whether or not we should put the rates issues into another bill, but what we decided to do, that the most transparent way to approach this would be to have effectively a single clause bill dealing with this one particular issue. So that would be clear.
Okay. And even though we could take it into the next mandate, you would like it done in this mandate, because obviously the way we will be in some form of stasis for a considerable period of time, it would be better to get it here so it's in position, so you're not having to put in retrospective legislation.
Well, it will still have a retrospective effect. This will have. I think the issue that's more of concern to us is what it will require district councils to do, I suppose, whenever they're considering their rates for next year. So what they're currently presented with no guarantee that it will be dealt with, is a substantial risk of having to make a major refund to businesses, because if NAVs are changed, there could be a hole in their finances. They will factor that in or price that into whatever rates they set, so the rates will inevitably be higher as a consequence of that. Whereas that doesn't need to happen. You can't set the rates for businesses and domestic ratepayers at this point higher in the pandemic situation. That would be damaging, I think, for both householders and for businesses.
Okay, thanks for that. Keith?
Okay, thank you, Ian and Sharon. First of all, I'd just like to thank you for your work you did all the time, but obviously last year and this year you've been very helpful, and personally, and no doubt all our members would say the same. So
thank you.
There's lots of emails at Sunday nights, so it's not just a Monday or Friday, and I do appreciate that, and more importantly the businesses do. I have a couple of questions. The 4,200, if I get that figure right, that have applied or appealed the figures, how many of them have appealed that based on COVID being the issue?
Yeah, it's over 2,000 of them have actually quoted COVID-19 as the reason for the appeal. However, now that valuers are speaking to the various ratepayers, it's clear that there's an underlying impact of COVID, that they didn't necessarily write it down on their application form, but when you're talking to them, they talk about fall in trade, changes in their circumstances. So there's very few actually that you could process as being completely non-COVID, and those ones have been handled already by LPS valuation. There's over 650 have already been
non-COVID.
Non-COVID
So
ones.
when was the first, I know you might know the exact date, but I presume nobody appealed prior to the 1st April 2020. I presume they'd be well in advance of that.
Yeah, again, these are appeals that arose out of the new valuation list that came into force in April 20. So any challenges made after 1st of April are only apply to this list.
And many, what would be the normal period of time for those to be addressed? Say go back 3 years and somebody appealed it, or 5 years. What's the normal period of time for that process to take? And then following on from that, so somebody, let's say somebody appealed in July of last year, based it on purely COVID. I think that application just sits. Is that sitting?
That's sitting at the moment because we're waiting to see if we can get this resolved through legislation. The rates order says that your application should be dealt with within 3 months, so people have been waiting 2 years. Although after a revaluation there's always this influx of appeals and it does take longer to process them, but certainly for the 2015 list, valuation had cleared all of the challenges within a 2-year period, whereas in this set of circumstances they haven't cleared any that are related to COVID.
So you referred to 74,000 on the NAV list. Just remind me of businesses. Business got a 4-month and then a further 8, was not correct?
Yeah.
Was there another certain type of business got an additional year?
Yes, so any of the businesses who got the additional 8 months last year also got the full 12 months this year.
So ultimately they'll have a rates bill to April, May next 22.
They haven't had a rate bill for 2 years.
So is there any of those businesses, and I don't obviously want to know individually, but is any businesses that have no rates to pay has put on what's the word?
An appeal?
Yeah, an appeal.
Yeah. I mean, anybody can appeal any valuation at any time. There's absolutely no bar on that. Certainly when the challenges and the appeals started coming in April 20, it was unclear then how much of a rate holiday they would get. So people were thinking ahead, and at that point the lockdowns restrictions were temporary. So they were still thinking, I'm going to have a rate bill later in this year, and they've put in their appeals. So yes, we do have some from those.
This last question for me, Chair. So this legislation, if passed, then I presume then wipes out those 2,000 odd appeals or whatever it is, because we're going back to the 1st April 20.
It'll wipe out the appeals that have COVID-19 grounds as a valid challenge. But there are lots of other appeals that we can deal with that are nothing to do with COVID-19. We still have to do those.
And can an individual, say they appealed it on whatever grounds, they thought it was too expensive, can they then add in COVID later on? Or is that at a point in time whenever they put in that appeal? You know, if they use a reason at that point of time, can they add on to that reason, now using COVID as...
You can make another challenge, as many as you like, but you can only do one at a time.
Okay. And can you do another one whenever one's still in the process, or have you to wait till it's completed?
No, you have to wait till it's completed, because when that decision is issued, you have a right of appeal to the Commissioner. You can bring other things in at that point if you want the Commissioner to consider other things that weren't taken into account in your first stage. It's not really the norm, but yeah, that can happen.
Okay, that's fine for now, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, cheers, Keith. Philip?
Thanks, Chair. The 250 million that quoted, is that worst case scenario in terms of the potential cost for this? And how many businesses would need to be successful to amount to that figure?
Well, 255 million is the upper end of the scenario. Now, we did take a look at two possible interpretations of the legislation, how that might be applied. So there's quite a narrow definition, and then there's a slightly broader one. So in the narrow definition, the amounts involved are smaller, because then you reduce the range of circumstances and the impact of that on the valuation. Though we think that's the less likely of the two scenarios. The more likely one is that a broader interpretation would be applied by the Lands Tribunal to any case that came there, and then that gets embedded into case law and then has to be applied to other cases. So we then, working through that, there'll be some types of business which will not be affected by the impact of the coronavirus, so then they won't have a reduction. Other types of business much more severely impacted. And then a range in between. We've made some assessments of different categories of business, how many are involved there, what kind of loss might be involved in each one, and then have a range of potential losses in each case. And as I mentioned earlier, an individual case, it may only require a couple of hundred cases to produce quite a large impact on the rate base and the revenue, because, as I said, you have to apply the outcomes of an individual challenge against similar properties elsewhere in the list.
Okay. And then just following on from some of the points that Keith was making, so there's the normal process of applicant who will just not be happy with their valuation, and then there's the ones in terms of COVID, so that this bill will close down the COVID. The 45 million that you're referring to then, so it will be specifically for businesses who can demonstrate in some way, whenever there's a process put in place, that COVID has still or is still impacting on them. Am I right in that?
Well, no, we've still to decide how we're going to handle it. What's the best way to approach it here? The kind of process that you've described there is one option, obviously, but it would be an application-driven process. And as you can imagine, then there are subjective issues in there about the extent to which they might have been affected, and whether they would have been affected, and whether they would have been entitled to a reduction. So we're going to have to look at what would be both equitable in terms of who would be affected by it, and also what's going to be possible to administer quickly and easily and transparently.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, cheers, Philip. Jim?
Yeah, first of all, apologies for my late arrival. I got caught up in an overrunning audit committee, so I didn't hear all your introduction, so you may have answered the questions I'm about to ask. There was Westminster legislation on this very subject.
Yes.
We would have had the option of a legislative consent motion. Yes?
I don't think it would have worked in this case, because their rating legislation is differently structured and ordered from ours. Now,
well, they applied to Wales, didn't they?
Well, yeah, Wales operates under the same rating legislation as England, even though the rates are a devolved matter.
Okay.
So we have our separate rating legislation here. The references to the articles, the terms that are used, and so forth are different. They have a different cycle of valuations. So we've actually got a different kind of problem, in a sense, than what England have. So in the English situation, they're dealing with what's called material change of circumstances. So at any point during the life of their list, if there's a material change to the circumstances of your property, then you can make an appeal on that grounds, and that is what is happening with all their COVID-related ones. Ours is actually about whether or not the original list is correct. So we didn't actually look seriously at the option of piggybacking on the English legislation. Instead, what we decided to do would be better, more transparent, clear and easier to understand if we put our own legislation here.
And why did it take you so long?
To do this. It's taken every part of the UK quite some time to work through all the implications of this. Now, this is not a measure that you would take lightly, as you can imagine. It's retrospective legislation. And we needed to make sure we understood what the actual impact was and whether this was a proportionate response to
Was the delay in the department or at the executive?
No, the department has taken quite some time to make sure we understand fully what the issue actually is. And it is not, well, it's easy for me at this point in November 2021 to explain in quite straightforward, I hope, terms what the nature of the issue is. That has not been clear all the way through this process. It took us until August of 2020 to actually get confirmed that there was a legal implication from Article 39 applying to the new list. It has taken some time thereafter to gather the information about what the extent of that impact would be, bearing in mind that the list is on the 1st of April, so it should reflect what a reasonable set of actors would do in a transaction relating to the rent of a property on the 1st of April 2020, at which point nobody knew really what the impact of the coronavirus would be.
But from the business point of view, COVID has not been a one-off event.
No.
It has legacy issues which impact maybe for years to come on some businesses. But what you're wanting to do is to deny the businesses any relief on the basis of the legacy impact.
Well, I would really have to dispute the notion that we've denied them any relief. We've spent £515 million on rate relief for businesses.
Yes,
for 2
for
years.
those specific years. The point being that the damage of COVID business-wise doesn't end at the end of this rating year.
No.
It permeates beyond that, and you're wanting to shut off the opportunity for the business, which otherwise could succeed in an appeal on that premise.
It will be for 1 year for those businesses, given that we are doing another revaluation exercise, which will have a new list, which will take effect from the 1st of April 2023. And that list will take account, amongst other things, the economic impact of the pandemic. So effectively what we're doing with this piece of legislation is changing the COVID impacts from being a physical impact on the property to being an economic impact of the kind that is best dealt with during revaluation.
The antecedent date that you brought to us was what, October?
2018?
Yeah. You told us at that time that there would be no financial implications of that. Is that right?
Are you referring to
No,
the impact of
the
revaluation?
AVD date was changed to the 1st of October 21.
Oh, right, for the current revaluation
Current one,
exercise?
yeah.
Yes. Okay,
It's
yeah.
going to impact the rates review.
Right, so the revaluation exercise is a revenue neutral exercise. So the changes in the valuations should not produce a higher or lower rate bill overall across the whole of Northern Ireland and all businesses. What you do is you redistribute the current rate burden in a different way depending on the shifts in the market. So after the revaluation is done, you have your total new net annual value. There will be a growth factor or difference between that and the previous one, and then you adjust the regional rate by that amount, that factor. So it's a revenue neutral exercise, yes.
Is it right? Did you consult with anyone in this proposal?
No.
So the people most affected and the organisations that represent them have not been consulted with about this?
No.
Why is that?
Well, given the nature of the issue that we're dealing with, cannot imagine that there would be any outcome from the consultation that would change what we're likely to do. Now, there's a general principle that a consultation has to be meaningful, otherwise there's no point in conducting it. So if we were to enter into a consultation for the sake of form, which is essentially what we would have to do, in order to be able to say that we've done a consultation, knowing full well that the options available to us were no different before or after the consultation.
Well, that's a disarmingly honest answer, that you weren't going to consult on something you weren't going to change your mind on. But still, surely there is some semblance of need to consult with those whose pecuniary and other interests you're about to damage.
I'm not damaging anybody's pecuniary or other interests.
Well, you obviously concede their appeals would be likely to succeed. Therefore, you have to shut them down. And in shutting them down, you deny them the pecuniary advantage they would have won from winning the appeal.
We do. Now, we haven't either consulted with district councils about taking this course of action, and we have looked at alternative options, and they are effectively to try to work through this process and manage it by the way we handle the appeals, and effectively, it's not do nothing, there's a lot of work involved in it, but not take any specific action against it. Or we introduce a very expensive rates relief package, so eventually we buy ourselves out of the problem by having more substantial rates reliefs. Neither of those two options are actually, we believe, sustainable. There's a very serious danger to the tax base here, which needs to be dealt with, and it is not one that can simply be ignored. Now, having considered all the options and then looked at what's happened in England, Scotland, Wales, where similarly there has been no, as far as I'm aware, significant consultation on any of these measures, we are taking the same approach.
But you think it is sustainable to not consult and at the same time come to us and say, give us accelerated passage?
Well, there's no common law obligation to consult on any issue unless there's a specific statutory obligation to do so. What we think in this particular case is that if you are going to consult, you need to conduct a meaningful consultation exercise. If there is no likely prospect of there being any alternative to what you're proposing, then effectively your consultation becomes meaningless. So why would we do that?
Well, the alternative is to find the money to pay the businesses.
From?
Or wherever you find the money. Your minister's very good at putting his hand out to Westminster.
Well, I'm not getting into the politics of that. I would say, though, that any money that has to be found to pay for rates relief has to come from within the Northern Ireland's budget. So that means prioritisation has to be undertaken. So you could make a political argument, if you're minded to do so, that we ought to just put in another very expensive package of rates relief for next year and take the money off health, education, whatever other public services in order to do that. Or we can take this course of action that we're proposing.
Ian, would it be your view, sorry Jim, just across it there, sorry, Ian, would be your view then, if we decided not to go down this line, that the 50 million you were talking about as a Barnett consequential wouldn't come in our direction?
I would need to check what the position is on that.
We would probably need a bit of clarity on that.
I think that the Barnett consequential flows from the release of the £1.5 billion and the passage of English legislation.
Yeah.
That's right.
They haven't made it conditional, as far as I know, on us doing something similar.
That's right.
Right. Okay, we might need to seek some clarity on that.
Of course, we would have no guarantee the 50 million would even be used to help business. It'd be siphoned off into something else.
Well, this 50 million has been earmarked and ring-fenced for this purpose.
Has it?
Yes. If the legislation is passed.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, you finished, Jim? Jim?
No, thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Ian, and thanks, Sharon. And I want to say it anyhow. I want to thank your department for all the help that I got. My go-to man for all during the pandemic was Tony Loughlin, and I found him a great help, even with that which wasn't being dealt with. Your department was able to help me get names through the other parts. So it was. I want to just say a big thanks on that then, Chair. Thanks. It was on the question of the department undertaking no public consultation, but that was extensively answered to Jim. But there is no guarantee, but you're now saying there is a guarantee that the 50 million will, if we go down the route that you want us to go down here.
Well, to make this clear, the Barnett consequential coming from England is conditional on English legislation being passed. So there is no 50 million unless that English legislation gets passed. If the English legislation gets passed, then the 50 million does come to Northern Ireland.
Regardless of what we do?
Yes. Then it has been set aside to put in place a package of rates reliefs as partial compensation against this measure if this legislation gets passed. Right, so there are two conditions there, I suppose, to say that. Yeah.
That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Jim?
Well, first of all, I was watching the New Year's honours list there, and I was expecting at least a knighthood and a dollop of OBEs to be given out to your team, but unfortunately they've got lost in the post, but they certainly would have been deserved, and I would endorse Pat's comments about the excellent member of staff you had liaising with us. I thought he at least deserved a knighthood, but he didn't get it either. What I would say to you is, and I think Jim Allister has covered some of it. I'll give you a couple of examples in my own constituency where a hot food takeaway is beside a nightclub which has closed directly as a result of coronavirus, completely wiped out. And I'm not a great supporter of nightclubs, but I can certainly understand how they were dealt a desperately bad blow by coronavirus. Now, the takings of that hot food takeaway will be dramatically reduced as a direct result of coronavirus. Not in the sense that they themselves, they kept going throughout coronavirus, but the associated business. The other one is travel agents. Travel agents have been absolutely hammered by coronavirus directly. And had coronavirus not come along, they really wouldn't have been lodging appeals at all because, business was just ticking along merrily. Travel industry, 80-90% decline over this last 18 or 19 months. Whilst I understand where you're coming from here, I can see the logic to it. You're trying to protect the public purse and you don't want to open the floodgates to a whole lot of cases. Surely in the absolutely dire situation where it's incontrovertible that coronavirus has had a dramatic impact upon their takeover and their profitability, is it right to be closing the doors completely to that type of business?
Well, it's not closing the doors completely. There's one particular basis on which an appeal against the valuation.
That's the only reason they'd be appealing at all.
It's not always the case because they can appeal for lots of other reasons. But
I have businesses and they have nothing. They wouldn't have a care in the world had it not been for coronavirus.
Yeah.
And therefore wouldn't be interested in lodging an appeal. They mightn't no business likes its rates. No business accepts it's been rated fairly. I accept that. But these are businesses, and they're a very small percentage of the overall economy, who've been hammered. And everybody accepts that they've been hammered. And they could prove. I have travel agents in Southdown who could show you 80% of their business went in a 15-month period. 80%. Is it fair to deny them any opportunity to appeal their rates, rateable valuation, given those circumstances?
Obviously, there are issues about taking away anybody's right to appeal against a public decision. Set against that, you have to ask whether or not it is fair that piece of legislation which was designed to deal with a very particular or specific localised set of circumstances and difficulties gets general application across all businesses in Northern Ireland with a very serious damage resulting to the public purse. There are aspects of fairness in both directions here. So what we are, where we have got to in all of this is we believe that the package of rates release which have been put in place have been very substantial and very extensive, comprehensive, that we have taken a lot of measures to support businesses, grants in addition to rates release, in addition to a substantial cut to the regional rate, and that this, whilst it's not desirable and we wouldn't want to have to do this if there are any other options available to us, set against that, I think it is overall a fair package of measures. In and of itself, you can certainly argue that it would be that individual businesses may feel aggrieved because we're doing it. But whenever you look at the totality of what's been done in relation to rates and support for businesses over the pandemic, I think it is, set against that, it is a fair package.
And I think, at first glance, yes, I can certainly see exactly where you're coming from. I am uneasy about legislation of this importance where there was no consultation carried out. And I must congratulate you for being utterly honest in saying why, and utterly honest in saying we didn't consult anybody, and then been incredibly honest in saying why you didn't consult anybody. But still, that doesn't sweeten the bitter pill, in the sense that there's a retrospective element to this. There's no consultation. I worry about the precedent we set for less deserving legislation in the future. I have to say that. And maybe for officials coming along who we don't trust as much as we trust your staff, coming along with cunning plans to wipe out people's rights. And I wonder if this would stand up if it was judicially reviewed in court, what you're trying to do. I really do, because it's quite sweeping what you're trying to do. And sometimes it can be wrong to do right.
On the point about it being quite sweeping, there are unusual aspects to this. I'll not shy away from that. It is retrospective in its application, which is not normal. And also we are removing a right of appeal against a decision of a public authority, which in itself is not something you would want to do. On whether or not it's sweeping, we have endeavoured to ensure, as insofar as we future-proof this for the continuation of the pandemic, that this is very specifically limited to one specific set of circumstances and one grounds for appeal. So we're trying to strike the right balance between those unusual aspects of the legislation and what you normally wouldn't want to do, with trying to make sure it is as targeted and as specific and as limited in its scope as we can possibly make it.
The other point is there are some businesses who have made an absolute fortune out of coronavirus, who've done exceptionally well in their balance sheets. I talked to an accountant recently, and he says his businesses who had never made a profit or had broken even for years, suddenly, as a result of coronavirus, have made a fortune. But their rates are not being increased to reflect that because of the date of the valuation. So while some people have been denied their appeal, like the big multinational supermarkets, for instance, the off-licences, notice that they have been very, very quiet over this last 19 months. The off-licences industry have kept their head down because they've done fabulously well out of coronavirus. But they are not, there's no attempt to sort of redistribute the load, as it were, by increasing their rates, whilst in some way compensate businesses like the travel agents who have been absolutely taken to the wall by this.
That's what the revaluation exercise is an effort to do, is to redistribute the rates burden. So those businesses which have done well during the course of the pandemic and will continue to do well in the aftermath of it should expect to see their proportion of the rates burden increase. Those which have been badly affected by it and continue to be badly affected by it can expect to see theirs come down.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
Ian, just to talk about that, because obviously the revaluation will have to reflect considerably the changes that have been brought about. And obviously we know about supermarkets, we know about off-licence, we know about other businesses that have done sort of quite well out of it, whereas others have done quite badly about it. But that will be a significant change in the whole structure. I mean, it's not going to be a tinkering with it to reflect those sort of changes, because you say it's a cost neutral piece across it. So it will be a really significant shift. And again, that shift will be subject to challenge as well, won't it?
Well, yes, every revaluation is subject to that. I mean, Sharon she's the expert valuer, so she can talk more about how this works in practice. Though I would caution against anybody making too rash a prediction about what the outcome of the revaluation will be. It all has to be based on evidence, which we're still in the process of gathering.
That's what I was just about to say, Ian. We're at the point in the revaluation where LPS is seeking the rent and lease information from the business community. So we'll have sent out 55,000 requests since the 1st of October asking for people to tell us their rent, tell us what happened since the last revaluation, because it's that evidence that is analysed that goes to set the values for the next list when it comes into force in April 23. So it's extremely important the business community responds to those requests for information. And I know start of November there, the Commissioner of Valuation's getting ready to start sending out the first wave of reminders to all the businesses that haven't provided the information yet. And she'll do it again in December. She'll send another reminder out to everyone, because people sometimes need 2 reminders to remind them that they had to do this thing. But it's that evidence that the valuers in LPS will be analysing and using to set the values for the next reval. And it's impossible to say at this stage what the outcomes of that will be. We would expect to see some shifts in values in areas where rental values have increased compared to areas where rental values have decreased. That's the point of a revaluation. You're looking at those shifts and reflecting it in your new list. But it really does depend on the level of uptake we get from the business community, because this is their opportunity to influence the outcome of that list.
Yep. So we're doing this with the revaluation exercise, but we're not going out to discuss. There's no point. You said, as you said very clearly, and you don't think there's any value in going out and doing a consultation. No. Yet at the same time, and we're also consulting on the reval.
No, we're not consulting on the reval. We're doing it. The Minister announced the reval in June, and it's actually the shortest period of time between revaluations that we've ever done. It'll be 3 years between the last one and the next one. We've never done anything that fast before, and that is to reflect what happened since April 20, because it's the impact of the pandemic that will come forth in the evidence that's collected for this revaluation. Now, it might take a bit longer. It might take 2 or even more revals for all of the impacts to work through. And it's not just COVID, it's all economic changes that you're taking into account. You know, Brexit will have had an impact in there as well. It's all economic change. And that's why it's important that economic changes on that scale are dealt with properly at a revaluation and not by challenging the valuation list. Those are massive changes on a huge scale right across Northern Ireland, and they're properly reflected at reval, not through appeals to the Commissioner.
Okay. Matthew?
Accepting the point you made about there's no point in doing a false consultation, this is an action that you've effectively decided that it's almost force majeure on yourselves to do it, in your opinion, and England, Wales and Scotland have done something similar. Would it, if consultation wasn't a credible or, it wasn't going to be meaningful, would it have been better to communicate earlier in the year to business groups that, look, this is happening? Given that Westminster announced, I think in the springtime at some stage, that process started then, clearly early in the year, it started in Scotland. Would it have been better simply to say, this is happening? I appreciate you might not like it, but it's happening.
Well, we only got to the point of getting agreement to do it at the start of September. So during the summer months there, since the announcement was made that Westminster was doing it in March, we were liaising then with our counterparts in Westminster and Scotland and Wales. Scotland was in the same position as us. We listened very carefully to what was going on in Westminster and took note of that and thought, well, maybe it's something that we could try to do here, because up to that point we hadn't been trying to legislate for this particular set of circumstances. It was only after that announcement that we took that opportunity very seriously and really started delving into how we could go about doing that. So we worked on that over the summer months, costing up the various scenarios that Ian mentioned and what it would cost if we didn't legislate for this. And then in September, we put it to the Minister right away. So it has actually, in our opinion, been quite fast how we've got to this point. And we haven't announced it because we've only just got approval.
Approval from the executive?
Yeah.
And had you sought any modelling or costing of this, or legal opinion? Obviously, the two are connected, or there are two bits of the rationale, the modelling of what it could cost you, and also the legal opinion of the liability. Did you seek either of those opinions before you were aware that Westminster was doing this?
We sought very extensive legal opinion on whether or not our legislation would stand up to this level of appeals. And
I know that, but do you mean? I suppose what I'm asking is, had it occurred to you before the legislation was created at Westminster?
It certainly was one of the potential options that was identified during the legal consultations that we had in the latter half of 2020. So
this was an issue that was discussed then, that we are creating there is a potential for.
Yes.
Okay.
But again, as I said to Mr. Wells, this is not a kind of piece of legislation that you take forward lightly. It is retrospective in its action, and it does take away citizens' right of appeal, even if it is in limited circumstances. So it is not something that we were jumping towards doing if we could avoid it.
And so there's quite a basic common law principle of, well, I don't know if it's common law or not, Mr. Alistair will correct me, but it's a basic principle, as you say, that the citizens should be able to appeal, and you're removing that. One final question on, this is the question, the point here is that COVID-19 may have, don't know yet, lots of people assume it has, but it's been uneven, marked a structural change in how commercial property works, specifically in relation to retail, possibly also in relation to hospitality, we don't know yet. Is it not, in that sense, is there not more merit to the idea of someone appealing, given that it clearly, for some sense, it's sort of observable already that it has marked a structural change. It's not just a sort of cyclical, do you see what I mean?
Well, actually, that's an argument in favour of treating it as an economic
because
impact.
there's going to be another in
a reval, as opposed to a physical impact on the individual property.
Yeah.
So it goes back to the issue of what Article 39A was intended to deal with. So remember, it is your physical enjoyment of your own property, or an impact on your property because of other things happening in the locality of where you're located. So the structural impact on the property market is actually an economic outworking.
Yeah.
COVID. It is not a physical inhibition on how you can use your own property. So that's why I made the point to Mr. Wells about it being unfair to take one piece of legislation designed to deal with a particular set of circumstances and then apply it to some kind of economic outworkings of COVID. So yes, there will be that structural impact on the property market of COVID. I don't think anybody doubts that's going to happen. What it will look like, we don't know, and it'll probably take a couple of revaluation cycles to work its way through into the valuations properly, because deals get made and remade and renewed over extended periods of time. So it may well be in the middle part of this decade before we can see properly what the impact has been.
Okay.
Okay. So just to get me right, so what in fact you're being asking us to do here is to balance off against the potential risk of a loss of up to £250 million coming from rateable value.
Yes.
Based on the fact that the economic impact that has been affected on our businesses will be dealt with by the reval situation.
Yes.
And that is the trade-off that we're being asked to consider.
Yes, it's to treat coronavirus and the restrictions and the impacts as an economic issue, as opposed to a physical issue affecting an individual property, and to look at it in that context, in that lens, and balance the removal of the right to appeal and the retrospective
which is, I think, is a fairly significant.
Yeah, against the other measures that we've made around rates to protect and support businesses over the course of the pandemic.
Okay, Keith, you wanted to come back in
Yeah,
again?
quick question, and I just want to cover, Ian, regarding recovery review panel and where that sits with regard to LRSS, the 10k and the 15k as I referred to, and then rates holidays. We get a letter from the Minister, and I just want to clarify this. It says a letter will issue, this is specifically relating to rates holidays, a letter will issue to the ratepayers impacted, advising them of the withdrawal of the award, but that LPS will not pursue the amounts as unpaid rates. So where are you at with, let's call it errors, and I don't mean that disrespectful, mistakes, call it what you want, with all those different schemes? Are you trying to recover that? Or where do you go with it? Because there's also a good faith point in there as well.
Okay, the two aspects of the rates holiday and the grants. So on the rates holiday, we found a relatively small number and proportion of rates holiday awards, 12-month rates holiday awards, which were made in error. So it would be things like a few estate agents, commercial estate agents as opposed to residential, and other types of businesses that were misidentified as being retail, hospitality or tourism or one of the other categories that was entitled. So those people had that award applied automatically to the rate account. They didn't apply for it. It wasn't as if they came and asked for something fraudulently. They probably reasonably enough took the assumption that the department knew what they were doing and had made the award correctly. So what we're not going to do now is pursue those people for backdated rate bill. Though to keep the account correct, we are going to have to withdraw the rate award from that business and then write off that amount of money for that was awarded. The amounts involved, as I said, are relatively small compared to the total value of the rates holiday. For the grants, then we have altogether identified, I think it's about £6.7 million of payments made in error, some of which have been dealt with because people have repaid them already, and some of which have been offset against entitlements to other grants. That leaves us about £4.2 million still outstanding. What we're going to do is look at those cases. Some of them, a bit like the rates holiday, they will have been mistakes on the part of the department, either because the regulations changed very rapidly. For example, the executive decided on the 6th of January to allow phone repair shops to reopen. They had previously been closed. That was an unexpected announcement. We issued a payment on the 7th of January for another amount of money for businesses of that type. So they've technically been overpaid. So there's a case where they have done nothing wrong. It was a very rapid change in the rules. We didn't catch up with it. Therefore, we ought to consider whether or not they ought to be asked to repay that money. Then at the other end, there are people who definitely were never entitled, should have known that if they'd read the guidance notes, probably were aware of it and chanced their arm anyway, and we made a mistake. So between those two extremes, then we have to then work out whether there's good faith to be applied or whether we should pursue the payee for the money to get it repaid. We'll be taking those decisions over the next couple of weeks. And then for those we have decided need to repay the money, we will pursue recovery. We will be writing to those asking them to repay.
So what do you think the figure is sitting out there now that theoretically shouldn't be out there?
We know at the minute overpaid is 4.2 million.
But in every scheme?
Well, the other schemes now, the ones that were more recent, like the £10,000 scheme from last year, that's actually the Department of the Economy's scheme. So currently, as I understand it, there's £5.7 million potentially paid in there out of the 247 million that was paid out. The Department of the Economy is dealing with the recovery of that, so that's not ours, but we're taking basically the same approach to all these schemes. The LRSS is by far and away the biggest one. The error rate on the new schemes that we announced in March of this year and administered over the spring and the summer is around 0.1%, so it is very tiny sum of money by comparison. I think on the top-up payments, it's somewhere in the region of £80,000. So the far and away the biggest bulk of it is on the LRSS.
What do you, a final question, Chair. What do you think that total figure is out there, roughly, of an LPS figure that's out there that theoretically shouldn't be out there? And appreciate the goodwill point.
Well, not even allowing for the goodwill. I think it's about 4.4 to 4.5 million.
Covering all schemes
overall.
that the DOFs?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Ian, just a quick one. I'm just looking at the language that's been used in the legislation in England. Mm-hmm. Let's go through, and it's fairly broad definitions of what is meant by coronavirus. And actually, if I was somebody who was a drafter of legislation, it would be quite good because it would be a catch-all that just about cover just about everything. What's the specific language that we're proposing to use?
We define coronavirus as meaning severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 and then brackets SARS CoV-2. That's all. But there's an enabling power within this bill that will allow us in the future, if the coronavirus was to mutate and become known by a different name and there was another lockdown, that we would go to would introduce another regulation which would need affirmative.
Yeah, just looking at the English legislation, when it says, I'll not go over the whole thing, but it says with a view of compliance with any legislation which concerns the incidence or spread of coronavirus, with a view of compliance with any other legislation for reasons relating to the incidence or spread of coronavirus, which is any other legislation, which I think is quite a a catch-all phrase, and in response to and otherwise in consequence of any advice or guidance given by a public authority relating to the incidence or spread of the coronavirus, which obviously refers to everything that comes from. Yeah. So are we proposing the same thing?
Or clause 2, I mean, do you have it? You don't want me to read it out here, do you?
Yeah, just you could.
Or clause 2 says, for the purposes of this section, matters attributable to coronavirus include, but are not limited to, anything done by any person, and then there's ABC. With a view to compliance with any statutory provision which concerns the incidence or spread of coronavirus. B, with a view to compliance with any other statutory provision for reasons relating to the incidence or spread of coronavirus. Or C, in response to or otherwise in consequence of any advice or guidance given by a public authority relating to the incidence or spread of coronavirus. We've tried to limit ours to a very specific clause so that it couldn't be interpreted any wider than what we need it to be. This is just one thing we're trying to deal with, and it's for fiscal reasons only.
Okay, dokes. Any other members, anything to say?
Sorry,
go ahead, Pat.
Small one, Chair. Thanks for Sharon. Sharon, you were saying about the business community in response to the call for evidence in regards to rent.
Yes, please.
Pardon?
Yes, please.
So, I was wondering, that wasn't in our. I haven't seen that anywhere. Do you know? What I'm trying to say is, you have said it here today. I think it's, that it's great that we're able to do that. We'll encourage that as much as possible. Is there any information on that out there anywhere?
There's a Reval 23 website.
Right, that's on that?
Oh yeah, and
okay.
The letters that we send out would have included the information about why we need it.
Yeah, that wasn't sent to us though at all. It was only sent to businesses.
Businesses, yeah, business addresses.
Right. Okay, so could I ask, could
Yeah.
you send that to me?
Certainly.
All right, I know you said...
I'll send you some information on Reval.
Thanks,
Yeah.
I'd like that, thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you'll send it on to 55,000 other people.
Yeah, well...
55,000 other people watch us every week. You'd be surprised if people don't watch us.
No?
Okay. Ian, Sharon, thank you very much indeed. Look, you've given us an awful lot to think about. I think it's safe to say that we have a lot of questions. But thank you, as usual, for your forthrightness. Don't know how well it's going to do you, but thanks for being your honesty and clarity, as that we've come to know and respect you for, and the rest of it. And thank you, Sharon. And give our best back to the LPS and all the hard work you've been doing.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you. Okay, team. A couple of things coming out of this. I think we should be writing to the department to ask the question about the 50 million and the earmarking of it. That seemed to be a fairly specific figure that was coming out, and bearing in mind it's Barnett consequentials that comes anyhow. And I would like to get a statement from a clarification from the Minister that is in fact ring fenced.
Could that be held back? Could that 50 million, let's say all things being equal and it was in, I mean, is it going to go there for the purpose that it was meant to go to? That's the question.
I think it's a question about whether it's being ring fenced, because we know that if there's a Barnett consequential of 1.5 million, or we get 50 million of that Barnett consequential of 1.5 million, it normally comes straight into Northern Ireland unhypothecated. So, just because we say it's ring fenced, it doesn't necessarily mean it is ring fenced. I think I would like to have some clarification from the Minister that would indeed be the intent. The other question is, there's a lot riding here on the reval exercise, and particularly where we are in this reval exercise, and I'm not so sure, because I haven't heard it much from the business community, about the impact on sort of the information that's being gathered at the moment, and I don't think as many people are aware of the importance of where this is coming to as well. So I think it's important that we need to find out how the revaluation, what it means in business success or failure, and how it would impact upon the rates as well. So I think I would like to communicate with the Minister and the Department and ask them to see how much of this information is actually being provided, and are we doing enough to make people aware of the importance of this? Because I think that is of considerable concern to me, because if we go ahead with this legislation, and we're predicating it on the fact that it'll be based on the information, the balancing factor will be on the predicating of what's going through the revaluation. If people haven't given sufficient information to do that, we're not comparing like with like, so that would be a concern as well. And I think we should write to the Department for Economy, reference the Small Business Support Scheme.
Just around the question of the good faith. So there are going to be good faith write-offs for rates. Holidays paid in error, so there was a small business support scheme. Are they going to treat it in the same way, I think is the question.
Go ahead,
Chair. It'd be good to get a little simple spreadsheet, call it what you want, a breakdown of those outstanding elements, across all the different, the LRSS, the 10 and the 15, whatever sort of out there.
Yeah,
the figures.
The overpayments.
Yeah, so it's good to get that in a little spreadsheet from them. Just cool. Not too much reading, just a spreadsheet.
Just finally, before that, I thought that was a very valuable evidence session, but one of the things that I find of interest, of course, is that we know Ian and LPS quite well, and actually they give straight answers to straight questions, and the fact that he gave quite a lot of detail and the rest of it, and was fairly open with us, I commend. But I would also be quite concerned about the principle of giving this, where we get to this point of legislation, and whether that will be used as a precedent elsewhere, because I think we have developed a good working relationship with LPS and Ian particularly, so we know where we're standing with that. But I think sort of this process of removing sort of the right of appeal does fill me with more than a degree of concern.
Mr. Chairman, I would support you in that we're breaking every rule here.
Yeah.
We've had no consultation. There's retrospective application. We're removing the citizen's right of appeal, and we're going to give it expedited passage. So we're just basically.
I'm feeling very nervous about this.
The third Reich would have been impressed. And the only counterbalance is that we know Ian, we know his team, we trust them. They've never spun us any yarns, and they've been utterly honest. And what I'm saying to you, yes, I understand the motivation, but there's less scrupulous individuals out there who might try to use the same precedent. And I just, again, we've got eminent legal opinion in the room. I'm just wondering if somebody challenged this in courts, would it stand up, given the fact that so many basic tenets of democracy have been breached? Now, I know we have the power to do anything we like, but equally, we have to indicate that does it pass the sort of the reasonableness principle. So, we shouldn't just rush to the conclusion on this until we've seen the further information we're requesting. I also have my doubts about this 250 million. I think that's designed to scare us, because that's assuming that all of the appeals are successful and that they get a very large recompense as a result of their appeal. I still think we should also consider the businesses out there who won't recover, who have had an awful mauling. Now, some have come back remarkably well, but I still think the travel agencies in particular and the travel industry generally have had a mauling, and some of that may never come back. And I wonder how they feel about this being slipped through with no right of appeal. Like, what is the rateable value of a high street estate agent after all of this? I would say greatly diminished. Greatly diminished. How they've survived is by laying off staff, digging into whatever savings they had. But still, most of them are in a desperate situation, and we've been lobbied intensively. So I would like to see the colour of their money in the terms of the responses before I'd agree to expedited passage on this one.
The other thing, I'll just put through us out to the committee as well. Look, we're in a situation where there hasn't been any consultation. I would say that quite a few businesses are potentially not aware of that this legislation is coming down the track. And yes, if they've been following what has been going on in England and Wales, they might presume that something is coming this way as well. But I'm quite surprised that we haven't heard, if we've been proposing any other form of legislation, we all know as MLAs we've been inundated by sort of a commentary from the various sort of business organisations and the rest of it, and we haven't heard anything. I just wonder if it would be worthwhile us also considering sort of contacting some of the business organisations or the chambers of commerce and asking them what is their view on this, what are their concerns about it, because and I hear what my learned friend from sort of the South Down has said, but I mean we've already heard that a lot of this is going to be retrospective anyhow. We've already heard that it could have necessarily been taken into the next mandate. But having to bring through accelerated passage, I'm feeling very nervous about this. And I don't want to sort of impose my particular views on it, but I'd just like to take the soundings of the committee about where your views are on an accelerated passage, because I'm not that sanguine about it.
The Chair must say I'm very uncomfortable. No consultation, retrospection, and accelerated passage.
Doesn't sound right.
Pretty toxic mix. I don't think it's doable. But the other point is, Jim Wells made the point, I was just calculating in my head, have we got the real figures? If there's 2,500 appeals, and it could cost 250 million, that's 100,000 each.
Mm-hmm. It's over 3 years. I think it said 4,000 appeals.
I would have thought they said 2,500 were on the COVID issue.
Yeah, there was 2,000 odd on the COVID issue.
I think it was over 3 years anyway.
It's over 3 years.
Yeah, from 2020 to 2023.
That sounds an awful lot of money.
Yeah, Philip?
I was just on that point. I think what Ian said in his evidence, you don't necessarily have to appeal. If the appeal is successful, it then applies right across the board.
If it does,
if
it has
business.
Yeah.
So
test cases.
So, my view is the same as the rest of you. It's uncomfortable, but we listen to the argument. It's one of these positions where you're uncomfortable doing it, but it may well have been the right decision to make.
What's the consequences if we don't do it? I mean, how does it affect our district rate?
What can be brought as full registration and have a committee stage and just devise the process.
And it is retrospective.
Yeah, it's retrospective. So they'll simply park the appeals, I would have thought, pending any legislation.
That was another point that Ian did make, that local councils would be looking at this.
Yeah.
And, you know, potentially could be adding rates. So we could actually, by not giving certainty, you could be adding rates through the councils, upping their rates to compensate potentially.
It's interesting, just looking at sort of the documentation. I think sort of the local governments in England have been consulted, whereas ours haven't. So again, it's also impact it has on sort of, you know, we're trying to regenerate the high street, issues to bring account of COVID, economic recovery, and all those issues as well. I mean, there hasn't been the sort of the consultation process.
At what point do we have to make a decision about accelerated passage?
Chairperson, the committee has no role, actually, so you don't have to make a decision. It will come to plenary, and plenary will decide, but I think the Minister is hoping for an indication in advance.
Yes, but if the committee unanimously said we're against it, I can't see the Assembly voting us down.
Gemma, did you want to come in?
Not really. Just I am uncomfortable, obviously, with what everyone else is uncomfortable with, you know, the accelerated passage and right of repair and stuff. But I'd be concerned about the implications if we didn't pass it, or if we oppose accelerated passage. I think Ian gave a really good briefing there, as he always does, and it's always very understandable, which I really appreciate. And I understand exactly why he said there was no consultation. You know, if it's not meaningful and they weren't going to be changing it, then there was no point. And look, it does make me uncomfortable, but I just don't know if we have any other option, really.
Keith?
Yeah, to a degree uncomfortable, but doing nothing is not an option, I think.
Well, could I suggest that we...
You know, bluntly, doing nothing's not an option. There's too big a risk, but I'd like to see a breakdown of those. Not the figures for the other stuff. I'm talking about, Jim talked about figures there, the 4,000 over the 3 years, and how many businesses that'll multiply into. So if one shop gets it in Cookstown, for example, that could be all shops classification in Cookstown, or one pub gets it. So doing nothing, I don't think is an option. That's what we do.
Yeah. Okay. Pat?
No. I would be uncomfortable as well, just with it as it stands, and I think that there has to be a little more information come back to us.
Chair, I would endorse your view that we should write to some of the business organisations and take their temperature on it.
Particularly to those badly affected.
Yeah, well, I think sort of even writing to FSB and to FSB and maybe to Northern Ireland Chamber of Commerce, just asking for their perspective on it. And I think, look, I'm judging the temperature of the sort of the committee. I think we're all disquieted, particularly what it's like, and I think we probably need some more information before we would come to the conclusion of whether we would be willing to support accelerated passage or not. I think that sort of surmises it. Are we content to move on?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Okay, next, moving on to the Defamation Bill. And have we got Andrew?
He is there.
Team, whereas there's now oral evidence on the Defamation Bill, sort of Clark's briefing papers, page 106, Dr. Scott's paper is on 111, the Northern Ireland Raises paper is on 213, copy of the bill and table papers at page 5 of the table papers. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
Sorry we're running a bit late. We were dealing with rates and revaluations and the rest of it, so we're doing it. So we're moving now to sort of moving on to defamation as well. Andrew is works at the London School of Economics, has written extensively on the issues of defamation and the rest of it, and actually lives here as well. So thank you very much indeed for coming in, and again thank you very much indeed for coming in person. I'd just like to say the evidence session has been reported in Hansard. And Andrew, can you make your opening statement, please? Thank you very much indeed.
As well, thank you very much for inviting me along today.
As you said, my name's Andrew Scott. I'm an Associate Professor at the London School of Economics. In 2014, as you know, I authored the consultation paper for the Northern Ireland Law Commission on defamation, and then subsequently wrote a report for the Department of Finance in 2016. Since that time, I've served as an advisor to the Scottish Law Commission and sat on the advisory board of a similar study conducted in Ontario, so can bring some insight to the table as to what's going on in those jurisdictions. You're probably aware of the fact that the Scottish Parliament has recently legislated its own Defamation and Malicious Publications Act in 2020. That was modelled upon the 2013 Act passed by the Westminster Parliament, but is somewhat more simple in character and does some things slightly differently. I suppose, lastly, just to say that I've recently been undertaking a review of the operation of the law in England and Wales on account of authoring aspects of the most recent edition of Gatley, which is like leading text on defamation. And so I hope to be able to offer you some further insight as to how the 2013 Act is operating. Aside from that, really, I'm in your hands today, I suppose, as to the subject matter for the discussion. I suppose that I would sort of direct your attention towards various of the points I was making in the briefing note that I sent through. So in particular with regard to section 11 on the default position being trial by judge acting alone, on section 3 with regard to the honest opinion defence, also the points made about discursive remedies. But in addition to what's in the briefing note, I think it's probably worth highlighting the interplay between section 5 and section 10 of the Defamation Act 2013, because that's one area in which the Scottish Parliament has acted somewhat differently to what was done in England and Wales.
Why did they do that? Or is that because of the peculiarities of Scottish law? Or what was the...
Okay, so just to be clear, section 10 in the English Act provides for a default rule whereby an action should be brought against the primary publisher, so either the author, the editor, or the publisher of material, and not against any secondary publisher, retailers, distributors, online intermediaries, and so on, unless it was not reasonably possible to bring an action against the primary author. Now then, section 5 provided a scheme whereby there'd be some interplay between, let's say, an online intermediary and the anonymous author of some material online, and on account of that, then you would have a process set in train whereby it might become possible for a claimant to bring an action against the actual author rather than an intermediary. So there have been regulations passed under section 5 which provide for a rather convoluted scheme to allow that to come about. And I think in Scotland the idea was essentially that things didn't need to be that complicated. Mm-hmm. So the movement that they introduced, I think it's in section 3 of their act, was to make it a default rule whereby you could only bring an action against the author, editor, or publisher, and not against intermediaries of any nature, subject to an override provided for in section 4, whereby like somebody who'd been a recalcitrant publisher, inviting defamatory material onto a website, for example, which they were hosting, they could be designated as a publisher, so to allow an action to be brought against that person directly. I think more generally, as a matter of principle, it's desirable to have actions brought against like the primary progenitors of the defamatory content. It's almost a sidewind to allow an action to be brought against somebody who's rather like under-involved in the immediate publication. And like from a societal perspective, there's a concern that like an internet intermediary, for example, would be likely just to take material down when contacted by a claimant's lawyer, and that has a sort of a detrimental impact upon the material which is available in the public domain. Sometimes material which is of potentially profound public significance.
Yeah. Andrew, just because we're recording this for Hansard and this is part of the sort of the evidence session that we're doing for the bill as well, could you actually could you specifically talk us through your note as you go through, just so that we can get it on the record for sort of the evidence to enable us to do that? Okay. And that might trigger some of the questions, trigger some of the other questions as we go on. Okay. Sorry about that, but it means that we can build up, because we're fairly time compressed with the amount of time we've got for legislation here in the Assembly and our ability to get the sort of the necessary information through. But please.
I'm in your hands then. Sorry, you want me to go to?
Yeah, yes, please, if you could. Yep.
Okay, so in the note then, what I highlighted was the beneficial consequences of Section 11 of the English measure, which was providing for the move towards trial by judge alone. I mean, there are obviously constitutional reasons for keeping a jury in place, although it's notable that defamation is the only area of private law where a jury is used. And certainly whenever we were conducting the studies in Northern Ireland, we did hear evidence from a number of people who suggested that it would be desirable to keep juries in position, and that's a position which is readily acknowledged, I think. The downside of maintaining the jury is ultimately that everything of a factual nature is decided at the end point of legal proceedings, rather than as what we see in England now, matters being able to be dispensed with or determined relatively early in the legal process because the judge is able to determine factual matters by themselves. So that's particularly important whenever you're thinking about the Section 2 defence of truth, justification, as it be called in Northern Ireland, because there, like the meaning of the words in particular, and also whether what has been published is a matter of fact or the expression of an opinion, is enormously important. So instead of having a case which involves like multiple different arguments with a tremendous amount of pleading of evidence, all running alongside one another to be determined by the jury at the end point, you end up with like the clarification or the narrowing of the focus of the legal proceedings onto like specifics early, which allows everybody to know what the case is from a relatively early stage in proceedings.
Item to continue.
Yeah, if you could. Yeah.
Okay. The second point then I raised concerned the Section 1 serious harm test.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of background here with regard to the jurisprudence as it's developed under this provision. Primarily in a case called Le Show, or a series of cases called Le Show. What we saw there was the original intention behind Section 1 being to introduce like a means of striking out or getting rid of, broadly speaking, trivial cases early in proceedings. Now, it was always a slightly curious provision in that there was already two bases within the common law which allowed that to be done. But it was deemed desirable by the Westminster Parliament that this should be emphasised. In an early case in this area, a case called Le Show, a preliminary matter concerned the interpretation of Section 1. And what the judge at first instance determined there was that Section 1 required something more of the claimant than was required under the common law, i.e. they had to plead actual evidence as to the harm that they had suffered. Now, at the time when I was writing the documents for Northern Ireland, we had the Court of Appeal ruling in Le Show, and what it essentially determined was that Section 1 would be interpreted along the lines of the pre-existing common law rules, providing for strikeout of trivial cases or cases which didn't involve substantial harm. So at that point, I thought it was reasonable to recommend that Northern Ireland also included an equivalent to Section 1 in any prospective defamation bill. What's happened subsequently in the Supreme Court in Le Show is that you've had a reversion to the position adopted by Mr. Justice Warby, as he was in the first instance ruling, which again leaves us in a position where evidence of actual harm has to be pled by the claimants. The important thing about that is that type of evidence is often contested between the parties, and therefore it's the sort of thing which has been determined by the courts at the final trial rather than at the preliminary stage. Okay. So it's not serving the purpose of acting as a sort of a gateway provision through which, or an early hurdle which a claimant has to jump over. It's effectively serving as a reversal of the presumption of harm in defamation proceedings. Now, the irony here is that what the English courts have done is revert back to the common law rules and utilise those to strike out trivial actions as was originally envisaged with Section 1. Now, in the Northern Ireland documents, what I was suggesting was that Section 1 was still a desirable provision because early in the interpretation and deployment of Section 1, in a case called Cook against Mirror Group newspapers, you got a judge, I think it was Mr. Justice Bean, saying that if and insofar as a publisher offered a correction or a retraction of a defamatory statement early on in proceedings, in response to a complaint, essentially, that would likely negate, or could likely negate, any finding of serious harm in the future. So that's desirable in itself. It emphasises the potential value of discursive remedies, corrections, retractions, to obviate the types of harm that defamation is intended to redress. So for that reason, I suggested previously that Section 1 was still highly valuable, and I think that's probably still the position. Now, it might be preferable for provision for discursive remedies simply to be introduced into a bill directly, rather than by this sort of circumlocutionary route. Certainly, if you're relying upon the serious harm test to validate and valorise discursive remedies, then that will only effectively be obvious whenever serious harm is considered by the court at the final trial, whereas it may be better for everybody to know from the outset, that any prospect of proceedings has been precluded. The third theme then, which was highlighted in the briefing note, concerned a general point that was made quite often to us in the Northern Ireland Law Commission, which was that there's a real, real value in consistency or harmony, if you like, between the jurisprudence in defamation law in Northern Ireland and in England and Wales. There's a benefit to being able to piggyback in the Northern Irish jurisdiction upon the very much more frequently delivered jurisprudence in England. So the point I was making in the briefing note is that the current inconsistency between the main, in respect of the main defences in defamation law, as between the statutory versions in England and the common law versions in Northern Ireland, is becoming increasingly problematic, because what the English courts have been doing is emphasising, in respect of certainly sections 3 and section 4, but more broadly, that what the statutory defences are doing and how they're constructed is different to the old common law. The questions being asked are distinct, and therefore attempts by counsel and even in decisions of subordinate courts, attempts to rely upon the pre-existing jurisprudence are now inappropriate. So if we transpose that to a Northern Irish context, we can see that the potential value of English jurisprudence is lessening over time, which is not a problem in and of itself, but it obviously makes a comparative exercise of less importance or value.
Okay. Yep.
The next point concerns Section 3 and the structure of the honest opinion defence. There I was really making two general points, both of which I think have been picked up in the Scottish legislation. One was that there seemed to be not a typographical, but a minor error of construction in Section 3 with regard to the type of publication upon which one could rely as the basis for one's opinion. And secondly, an innovation in the report written for the Finance Department here was the idea that it should also be possible for, within the honest opinion defence, a publisher to rely upon facts that he or she reasonably believed to be true at the time of publication. So the illustration there would be like somebody reading something in the Times newspaper or watching something on Newsnight and maybe tweeting in respect of what they'd just seen. And you'd be essentially allowing that person to rely upon facts which ultimately proved to be false in the reporting by that major national entity in order to find in order to defend or protect their expression of, surprise or distaste in respect of whatever had been written. So it was a desire to allow that person to avoid having to prove a major defence, effectively by proxy, to prove that what the mainstream publisher had done was true or had been responsibly developed.
How far do you take that down, do you think?
Say again, sorry?
How far would you take that? Because obviously, your quote sort of said Newsnight. We've obviously had problems with Newsnight and sort of the Bashir issues and the rest of it there. And sort of one of the concerns I would have is, how far do you take it down? Scientific, it's easy for scientific journals. Has it been peer reviewed? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. It takes it into that position as well. But if you're reflecting opinion that has been produced by the media and the rest of it. How do we get to that point where there is an accepted understanding? That's a bit I can't sort of get to.
Yeah, look, I suppose the point here is that you're just wanting to see the law sort of reflect, sensible public policy in this area. So we're talking about somebody who is effectively doing what we want people to do whenever they receive and listen to and read quality journalism. We want people to talk about the things that they've read. We want them to communicate on matters of public importance. That's ultimately what journalism is for. So we're really sort of talking about a situation where somebody effectively does what we hope they would do as a citizen. Maybe expresses, perhaps even in vituperative terms, a viewpoint based upon what they've heard. But we're saying that they shouldn't face liability for having done that. Now, at the same time, what you're really doing is refocusing attention on the primary author there. If Newsnight fundamentally get it wrong, they should be held to account for what they've done. Or likewise the Times or somebody else. But there is a balancing act here. There is a tension between allowing people to recover and to vindicate their reputations on one hand, and allowing people to act, the way we hope people to act in the exercise of their free expression rights at the same time.
Because you can see that, because you take that expression from sort of the national level to the Northern Ireland level. So you're drilling down sort of one level of where you get to the point of where it comes to honest opinion. So obviously within Northern Ireland, of course, you're that next level down. So the ability to be able to say a piece of information is, to that degree, has been fact-checked. Has not been slanted in one particular area. It creates sort of quite considerable concerns.
I absolutely see what you're saying, but ultimately I suppose it would come down to the reasonableness of the belief that the person had in the underpinning facts, and that's going to be a question of fact to be determined, by an individual judge in an individual case. Is it reasonable to rely upon Newsnight? Probably yes. Is it reasonable to rely upon what your cousin, told you down the pub? Probably no. But there's no doubt a grey area in between those two things.
Okay, thanks.
The final point then, or the final 2 points I was making on the briefing note then, concerned generally the desirability of discursive remedies and the opportunity to rely upon corrections or retractions to preclude the prospect of future action. And then secondly, the final point really related to a sort of more general sort of dissatisfaction with the reform process in England and Wales, equally here. That very often what people were concerned about was abusive or exploitative legal actions being brought. But in England, there was no movement towards trying to address that specific type of abuse directly. In many other jurisdictions, we have seen the introduction of statutory intervention, but also rules being developed by common law judges, which provide for the more ready striking out of abusive legal actions. So there's a movement abroad at present, I suppose, across Europe, in the wake of various sort of cause célèbre libel concerns and the experiences of various investigative journalists to respond to what are known as SLAP actions, strategic lawsuits against public participation, to respond to them directly. And in the English context, I think there's been a movement among a number of different NGOs and media organisations to try and develop a momentum towards addressing specifically that type of abusive process. And I think that's something which a committee like this or any legislative body should think further about. There are an increasing number of exemplars around the world, most notably in, I think, Ontario in Canada, which show that this type of legislation can be sensibly introduced and can work solidly well. So that's essentially what you find there.
But I think sort of, again, so you probably answered your own question and sort of I said, but do you think we need this legislation brought forward in Northern Ireland?
Sorry, the Defamation Bill?
Yeah.
Look, I think it was implicit in the fact that in the report published by the Department of Finance, there were two proposals. Mm-hmm. Okay, the first of them being a bill equivalent to this one.
Yeah. I
think it's implicit in the fact that there was a second bill that I thought a number of the respondents to the Northern Ireland Law Commission consultation thought that more could be done.
Yeah.
But I think as a first step, the proposed bill is sensible, subject to appropriate revision.
The bill proposes that the presumption in favour of jury trials for defamation trials be removed. Your report in 2016 supported this as long as the bipartite proposal, which relates to the single meaning rule, was adopted. Can you explain what you believe the benefits of the judge-only trial might be? Apart from is it just that it will simplify the process, or there will be a higher threshold for bringing it forward?
No, okay, so if we draw a comparison with England and Wales, what you're seeing there today is a number of fundamental questions in any defamation action being able to be brought to the court early, because the judge is able to determine the factual dimensions of the questions. So questions over the meaning of what's been published, questions over whether something is factual or opinion in character, and then questions about the defamatory tendency of what's been published can be determined quickly. And when I say quickly, I say that in inverted commas, because we're still talking about something which happens maybe, in some cases, about 3 or 4 months into the process, but in many cases, maybe a year and a half into the process. So fundamentally, what you're getting at that stage is the clarification of the proceedings and the dispensing with a lot of the sort of fluff surrounding factual questions, and because of that, you're seeing much more efficient dispensation at the final trial as well.
Yeah, look, we're hearing a lot now, and obviously you've seen the whole issue to do with Facebook renaming itself Meta and implications of websites and hostings and that information as well, and the whole social media aspect of it. Do we have to have protections built in for the website operators?
The concern about so the background to this is that our definition of who is a publisher in the law is extremely broad. So without legal protections for such people, they will be caught, by that definition, and hence potentially be liable themselves. So that's liable jointly and severally for all of the harm which has been caused. Okay. So if you are an online intermediary of that type, and somebody presents a legal action or prospective legal action to you, your natural inclination is to try and minimise your legal risk by taking down the content which is being complained about. Mm-hmm. Now, many times that will be great. The content is clearly defamatory, clearly outrageous, and that's a good outcome. But sometimes it won't be a good outcome in the sense that, important complaint will be taken down, essentially because the online intermediary doesn't have an iron in the fire and doesn't care less whether the material stays up or comes down. The over-definition of publisher, if you like, creates a situation where the wider public can be under-informed. Okay. What was proposed in the second version, or the second version of the bill in the report for the Department of Finance, and what has now been legislated in Scotland, takes that secondary publisher outside of the definition. Okay. Now, ostensibly, when you look at that, you think, well, hold on a second, this is just going to allow a free-for-all online, and that's clearly not an outcome that anyone would desire. But if we dig deeper into what would then actually happen, we see that probably the solution already exists in the law, okay? Because, now you take another step back. The rules at the moment with regard to takedown in privacy law are different to what you find in defamation. So it's essentially, it's very difficult to get an interim injunction from a court to require takedown at a preliminary stage in defamation, whereas that's the sort of standard approach in privacy proceedings. Okay. Now, the reason for the difference is a case called the rule in Bonnard and a concept called the rule in Bonnard and Perryman. Okay. Now, what it says essentially is that if a complaint is brought to a publisher, or brought to a court rather, and the publisher says to the court, "We're going to defend this action," then no interim order will be given. Okay. So if we jump back into the context of online publication, usually the problem there is with anonymous publishers, people who we can't identify. Okay. If we can't identify the publisher, then you just sue them, straightforwardly, right? But when you have an anonymous publisher, you're in the sort of the quagmire where you have no one you can bring an action against other than the intermediary. Mm-hmm. So what would happen then if we move towards a Scottish type situation is that the claimant or the plaintiff here would bring a complaint to the court saying, look, this has been written about me, it's untrue, I want it to be taken down. And there'd be nobody on the other side to argue the case for an interim order not to be made. Okay. Now, the claimant's lawyer, whenever they come to the court, is under a legal, a professional obligation to effectively give the gist of the argument that might be presented from the free speech or publisher side of the fence. So the court is in a position then to get some insight into what the relative balance should be, and will decide whether or not an interim order should be made. Now, the Scottish position was that under their rules of civil procedure, that could happen extremely cheaply and extremely quickly, such that a court order would be presented to the online intermediary, to which they will respond for fear of being in contempt of court, and very quickly the material will be taken down. But importantly, the difference there is the online intermediary hasn't just taken down in order to minimise its own legal risk. A judge has determined, in shadow form, okay, a judge has determined the Article 8 reputational, Article 10 expression interests, has determined the balance between them and acted appropriately. So that can all be done essentially as quickly as making a complaint to an online intermediary, but you're more likely to get the intermediary responding as you would hope that they would respond, because it's a court order. And despite what people tend to think, the Twitters, Facebooks of this world do tend to respond to court orders in a way that sometimes they don't respond to the threat of a legal complaint being brought. So,
all right. Okay. Jim?
So, Professor, you don't like juries?
No, I think, as I said earlier, I think there's a profound constitutional role for juries, certainly in criminal law and potentially in defamation proceedings, and that's why they're there in defamation proceedings.
Given that defamation is fundamentally, in our definition, whether one's reputation has been lowered in the eyes of others, is there not a perfect match between that and a jury making that decision?
I think in principle, you would say that it would, or one would say that it's desirable for a jury to take that decision, because, as you imply, it brings you closer to a correct decision on with respect to the nature of the harm that's been wrought. The essential problem, however, is one of efficiency. So in an ideal world, yes, you would empower a jury to take these types of decisions.
Which is more important, efficiency or justice?
Well, your comment implies that you wouldn't get justice through a judicial decision, and I think that that's not entirely correct.
Your response suggests you mightn't get justice through a jury.
Well, I think I said in an ideal world you would get a jury taking this decision, but
under this bill you're taking that away.
In the real world situation, I think given the impact of the law as it operates at the moment upon wider interests alongside, the question that you're speaking to, in terms of access to justice for both publishers and for complainants, the ascription of this role to a jury effectively defeats the purpose. So nobody is getting any justice on account of the system that we have at the present time.
This bill does much more than that. It makes it much more difficult to bring a libel action because of Clause 1. In that the lie told can be mitigated by the fact that it's quickly taken down or apologised for, or it doesn't actually cause, in consequence, serious harm. So are you not inviting irresponsible journalism, where they know we can take a risk here? We can say what we want to say about the footballer or the politician, because all we have to do is get it out there and then tomorrow apologise for it.
I can see that point. I think there are two responses to it. The first thing to say is that one of the primary things that a claimant will say that they want whenever they're bringing a libel action is a swift correction of what has been published. At the present time, with the libel system as we have it, that type of swift correction will never happen. Essentially because it amounts to like a concession on behalf of the publisher. Okay. Sorry, I've lost my chain of thought.
Do you accept that it gives more scope for reckless journalism by virtue of the fact they know that if they publish something that they can't stand up but swiftly apologise for it, they have denuded the defamed person of any remedy, because they can't then show serious harm because so much weight is put upon the fact that they so honourably withdrew it.
Okay, so I think if we're talking about journalism in this context,
Yes.
okay, and not just the citizen journalist or the random social media commentator, I think we have to recognise that media organisations themselves rest upon their reputations for credibility. And ultimately, if you are, in the Northern Irish context, the BBC or the Belfast Telegraph or the Irish News, and it's widely understood that you publish nonsense with regularity, nobody's going to pay you any attention. So those organisations must pursue quality journalism, or their role within the broader society falls apart.
That's not much comfort to the person who's had the nonsense journalism published about them.
Okay, well, there's another response to this as well, which is to say that many of the greatest scandals that have been defended or protected or have been prevented from coming into the public domain have not come into the public domain because of the existence of libel laws of the type that we currently find in Northern Ireland. So sometimes it would be desirable for a journalist to be able to make an allegation without fear.
The person who's genuinely defamed, they just have to sacrifice their reputation for the greater good.
Well, you're suggesting that the discursive remedy has no impact, and I would suggest that it does have a profound impact. In fact, it's precisely what claimants say that they want whenever they bring legal proceedings in the first place.
What it successfully does is it defeats the action being brought, because then the consequence is that the serious harm is so diminished that the action loses its traction and its capacity under Section 1 to proceed.
If there was serious harm of the type that you're describing, after the apology or correction or retraction has been made, then you'd be able to demonstrate that in court.
But you're saying that you should only be able to bring a libel action if you can show serious harm.
Yep.
So the small lie, so to speak, is okay. You just suck that up.
I think that's the policy choice there, yeah.
That's an horrendous choice to impose.
Well, I think it's an horrendous choice.
Innocent citizen, is it not?
It's an horrendous choice in circumstances where the allegation is a profound one,
Yes.
But a mere retraction may not amount to a negation of serious harm in such circumstances.
But surely the issue about the trivial damage is met by trivial damages. Is that not the right way to approach this? If you're only slightly damaged, you get slight damages.
Yeah, it's not actually what claimants say they want. Claimants tend to want a correction or retraction as early as possible, and then they're able thereafter to point to the correction or retraction
The only thing
in order to highlight that what was published about them was wrong.
Yes, the retraction goes some way, but anyone who brings a claim for defamation, the only thing they can ultimately get is damages.
Well, you've got to look at the purpose of damages in defamation proceedings. I mean, one of the primary purposes is vindication. So if vindication is achieved through other means, then you don't need that measure of damages. Yes. Now, beyond that, then there's damages for distress, which are meagre. There's damages for the notional harm.
Damages and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Well, so one of the primary components of the damages that are received is for vindication, and if you've already been vindicated, you don't require those damages.
But it's not much of a price for a libeling publisher to say sorry.
Well, as I say, I suggest that somebody who's in the game of publishing has to maintain a reputation for quality work.
I'd have to say, of your evidence and what I've read it, I'm struggling to find any empathy with the defamed.
Well, as I say, if I was in a position where I had been defamed and somebody was within 7 days publishing a retraction or a correction of what they've done, to which I could thereafter point anytime anyone ever raised the suggestion that I had done something that was wrongfully alleged about me, that would be effective.
You don't think it'd be much more effective if the publisher of that libel had to punitively pay for it?
Well, look, I think what you're saying is, what you're suggesting is that the law should operate as a form of sort of media regulation, you know, and there are other systems of media regulation. Well, no doubt it does because of the paucity of media regulation, but that's a separate question. You know, if the media needs to be regulated, it should be regulated. You know, we shouldn't be doing it by, you know,
But
by
you're
individual.
totally deregulating the punishment that can come from publishing something which is defamatory.
I'm suggesting that we're changing the nature of the punishment that happens. You know,
Is it any surprise that the backers of this sort of proposal tend to be the media organisations?
well, I think that some of the backers of proposals of this type are media organisations.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
But there are many other backers of this type of
Why do
measure.
you think the media organisations are backers of this?
Well, what I was going to say is that there are many other types of person who are equally interested in the legislation of measures of this type, and certainly, as I understand it, the people who were really driving forward these proposals were people who were concerned about the impact upon, the work of NGOs, the work of scientists working in the public interest, and so on. Each category of person regularly faces, the threat of punitive costs and damages, and therefore is precluded from pursuing public interest purposes that they would otherwise choose.
That's the sector you're trying to protect. That can
Well,
be,
look,
that
I-
can
look,
be
I should
protected
add-
without the revolutionary idea of punitively putting defamation beyond the reach of the average citizen, because they have to now cross that high threshold of serious harm, and serious harm which can be readily overturned by a mere apology.
So you talk about the average citizen, but the plain fact of the matter is that the average citizen currently cannot go to law. Has no prospect realistically of vindicating their reputational rights.
They have less prospect now, because not only does they have to take the financial risk.
If they haven't suffered serious harm, then they don't need to go through the legal process.
But the test, that's because you want to change the test to
No, it's
serious
not
harm.
changing
You're
the
back
test.
to the point.
And what I
you're back to the
suggested
point
to you earlier
of
on
saying
was, in
the
fact,
small lie's okay.
what I suggested to you earlier on was that, in fact, the way in which the law is operating in England and Wales is exactly the same as the way in which it's currently operating in Northern Ireland in this regard.
Well, not exactly the same, because
in terms of dismissing trivial cases, it's exactly
we have
the
the
same.
Supreme Court ruling of what serious harm means,
Yes.
which is what you'd have to show
Yes.
under Section 1.
Yes.
So that increases the burden on the plaintiff. That lifts the bar. He has to get over that bar. So he's taking extra financial risk, not just in bringing the case, but in bringing the case which is now harder to prove.
So I don't think that's actually correct. I mean, fundamentally, the rule with regard to trivial cases is effectively the same. Now, when you come to the final trial and this issue becomes is litigated, what you're finding being presented to the courts is exactly the same type of information that would previously have been presented to the courts with regard to the determination of damages. So yes, it's speaking to the question of liability, okay, but it's the same information developed in the same way and presented to the court at the same time. So that's not changing the burden in any respect.
Break the liability barrier.
Through the chair, but
Sorry,
Andrew,
yeah.
just for my own education, the Supreme Court ruling, what was the change that it made that raised the bar as?
Well, it doesn't raise the bar. What it does is actually speak to a different issue. Okay, so the way in which the Court of Appeal had interpreted Section 1 would effectively have kept the rule the same as it is in Northern Ireland as it was under the common law.
Yeah.
Whenever the case went to the Supreme Court, what they required was that you demonstrate evidence of actual harm.
Yeah.
Now that evidence could be inferential evidence, and there's a question about how far or how readily the court will infer the evidence of harm, but it tends to be only in serious cases. So what's happening now is that at the final trial, the claimant is having to plead evidence which demonstrates the amount of harm that they have suffered. Yeah. Now, why this is different to the trivial cases scenario is that formerly what was the position in Northern Ireland, the position under the common law in England and Wales, was that harm would be presumed, okay? Mm-hmm. Right. And then the court would take a view as to what the likely extent of the harm would have been and so on. Now, in taking that view, it would have been informed by evidence pled with regard to the nature of harms which have been suffered. That evidence will still be pled to the court at first instance. Okay? But when that happens, they'll be speaking not only to the question of the measure of damages, but also to the question of liability. Now, both of those things are happening at the final trial. Okay. So, I mean, the getting rid of trivial cases or cases where you wouldn't have substantial harm being caused is now going to be happening still at the preliminary stage before a judge.
Right. Okay.
But under a different legal test of
Well,
Section
it doesn't
1.
ultimately matter what the legal test
Suppose
says
if you have to
if
get
the
through it.
practical impact is the same.
If you have to get over the test, it matters. If it's a higher test than it previously was.
Yeah, but this isn't happening at a preliminary stage. This isn't speaking to the question about getting rid of trivial cases. It's happening at the final trial where the issues have been narrowed and where the evidence which you're presenting would have to have been presented or would normally have been presented to court anyway. So I don't see that that's a particularly significant increase in the burden upon claimants.
So you think it makes no difference to say that the law presently says you bring defamation proceedings if your reputation has been lowered in the eyes of reasonable people, and now you bring it if you can show you've suffered serious harm. You don't think that there's a difference there?
Well,
if there's no difference, what's the point in Clause 1?
Well, quite. You know, what was the point
Well,
of
we
Clause
could
1?
remove Clause 1 and do no damage.
No, the change is not to the question about substantiality of harm, you know, the threshold test, if you like, the gateway aspect, but to the presumption of harm at the later stage. Okay. So as I've suggested to you already, in practical terms, that doesn't significantly increase the burden on
There's no
claimants.
presumption now.
Say again?
There's no presumption now under Clause 1.
There's a presumption of harm at the
Yes,
present.
but not of serious harm. You still have to prove serious harm.
Sorry, in England and Wales?
Yes.
Yes, so there's no presumption of harm, therefore, effectively in England and Wales now either. You know.
One other point, when people were advocating this legislation back in 2013, they said, oh, if we don't do this, we'll have libel tourism. That turned out to be a nonsense, didn't it?
In England and Wales?
We'd have libel tourism in Northern Ireland if we were out of step, we were told. Hasn't happened.
I'm not surprised that it hasn't happened.
No. So it was a straw man.
I don't think it was a straw man in England and Wales. I think it was overdeveloped as a complaint in England and Wales, but there were certainly multiple
But the
cases
argument
in
was,
which this
if
had
England
happened.
and Wales goes with the Defamation Act of 2013, and we don't, we will become the object of libel tourism. Didn't happen.
Well, the proof
There
is
were
in the pudding,
libel
I think.
cases before 13 than we've had since.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at the data as to what
Well,
types of cases
35
are
per
being...
year before 13 and 30 since.
Sorry, 35 libel tourism cases in
No,
England and Wales?
35 libel actions
In Northern Ireland?
in Northern Ireland,
Yeah.
pre-13 per annum.
Yeah, well, as I say, I'm not surprised that we haven't seen a particular uplift from that type of claimant.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks very much. Bearing in mind the sort of the English and Welsh legislation at the moment, I know we haven't got specific defamation legislation now, but would we not have been in a better position to go down the LCM route,
Sorry, say again?
the legislative consent motion route?
I have no real insight as to why that didn't happen. What you're talking about, I suppose, is it, you know, introducing an equivalent measure to what would have happened on the basis of a consent motion. I have no real insight into that.
Yeah. Andrew, just go through, because you've talked about sort of how long you've been involved in this process, just go through the timings and timelines when you talked about the Department of Finance's first bills. That was back in 2014.
So, well, I maybe need to correct myself, but I think the Law Commission study began in 2013.
Yeah.
I think its consultation paper was published in 2014.
Yeah.
And then, from memory, I think the Department of Finance published the report I wrote for them in 2016.
Yeah, 5 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they've been, and now we're having to think about private members' legislation to do with something that went through the process.
It's quite remarkable that that time period has passed, certainly. But look, you can compare the situation to Scotland. They've gone through a similar process to Northern Ireland. They have now legislated. They've seen the need for legislation. We're not that far behind Scotland, but you know, if this bill is passed, then you'd be up to speed relative to where they are now.
Okay. Any other? Sure.
Just
Philip, go ahead.
briefly on that point, I mean, not getting into the delay in the time, but I mean, there's a review into the English Act, and there's a review going on in the South. You know, would it not be better waiting on the outcome of both of those reviews before bringing forward legislation?
So there's certainly a review being undertaken by, I think it's a 5-yearly review which is being undertaken in the South. It depends on which body of law you think it more important to align with. And the evidence that we received at the Law Commission was that the general perception was that it was more important to align with English law rather than Irish law. But in substance, I mean, the point about all of this discussion is that it's not really the substance of the law which is the concern. The concern is about the extent of costs and, respectively, the amount of damages which are faced, which is obviating the possibility of people actually ever going to court to vindicate their rights, or to defend themselves. So, in that respect, it doesn't really matter which body of law you emulate, because the two sets of law are functionally equivalent. The difference that is in place in the Republic of Ireland is the way in which you have integration with our system of media regulation, which we don't have here.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Philip. Sir, Andrew, thank you very much indeed for coming and there. Oh, sorry, Keith, sorry.
Sorry, Andy, just a quick question. Looking at this piece of this bill in front of us, what's the benefits of it?
Well, look, to some extent you're hunting the snark in this respect, because you're talking about actions which don't come to court, okay? Because very often people are frightened out of pursuing are unable to pursue the complaint if they have something defamatory written about them, and are perceive themselves to be unable to defend themselves before the court if they are sued. So they tend to capitulate and settle actions. And I think the data there, stacks up in terms of the frequency with which people bow out of legal action honourably or dishonourably. The information which we did have, there's very little hard data around, but the information we did have suggested that the per capita rate of libel actions being brought in Northern Ireland was relatively very high, in the order of 6 or 7 times as high as what you'd find in England and Wales. The general academic research evidence suggests that there is such a thing as the chilling effect, and that the chilling effect is felt most profoundly by what you might broadly describe as local or regional media, which is what you have in Northern Ireland. The impressionistic evidence, and there's an element of, well, they would say this, wouldn't they? But the impressionistic evidence that we received during the Law Commission study was that there was a real and biting impact of the threat of libel actions in Northern Ireland. And that is impressionistic evidence, but in some measure, that's actually the more important type of insight that one can glean, because if people are acting, if publishers, this is, are acting in accordance with their perceptions of the risk of libel proceedings being brought, then they are not exercising their free speech rights in the way that we might, as a society, hope that they would do. Okay. So in terms of hard evidence as to what the potential benefit will be, it's difficult to provide you with any. Okay. But the impression certainly is that it would be a significant impact.
Does this bill protect big fish and the wee fish?
My own diagnosis of the problems of defamation law in Northern Ireland is that it cuts both ways. The problem is one of access to justice, and that is for sure for publishers, but it's also for people wanting to vindicate their reputations by bringing legal actions. So the small fish in both of those scenarios is profoundly disadvantaged.
And one final question, if I may, just on the website, that's section 5. I asked the question of this bill sponsor regarding websites, and they referred to, we call Facebook and Twitter. We assume those are classified as websites, we assume. Does this strengthen this? Does this strengthen it for the individual? And Jim Allister referred to, if an individual says something tonight on social media that is incorrect, about me or Pat or whoever, that is lasting damage. It removed tomorrow is no good. It is lasting damage. So does this strengthen it for the individual, whether it be a politician or it doesn't matter who it is? If it's factually wrong, well, the website is wrong, or the individual put it up as wrong, but it has affected those individuals. It mightn't be serious harm, but has it caused them harm? Does this strengthen the law, and does it make that individual in a better position to go after the individual that said it, because it goes on day and daily? We can classify it as serious harm or harm, but it goes on and there's no politician in this room, and I'm only referring to politicians, doesn't get it day and daily. It's not acceptable. And we've seen the outworkings of that more recently, where the hate goes on and on and on. So does it make it more beneficial, or does it make it worse?
I think the straightforward answer is that it will the bill this bill
Yeah.
will not likely make a tremendous amount of difference to that situation. Now, that's because whenever we look at the way things have played out in England and Wales, under Section 5 and the regulations that have been passed under that, nobody is really operating under that regime. They're all still operating under the pre-existing regime, which is what we have in Northern Ireland. Now, under that pre-existing regime, if you make a complaint to an intermediary and they don't take down the material, then they'll be liable from that point forward. Okay? So that position won't change.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank you, Andrew.
Andrew, thanks. There is some of the questions about, we just got some further questions I'd probably like to ask you, and we'll send it to you if you could sort of respond to the committee to give us some evidence. I think it's particularly, we've, it was on kind of sort of paragraph 25 when we were talking about the jurisdictional bar, about prompt corrective action. So just in case, just so you can have a look at those as well. And also I think it was, and you've written down SLAPS, which I'm still trying to read your writing, but it's strategic
lawsuits against public participation.
Okay, could the law dissuade that? Sorry, I'm afraid I don't quite understand that. So, if we could ask you, if we sent those to you, to this, and Mayor, thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Yep,
Thanks very much indeed for sort of giving your evidence. Thank you. Cheers. Thanks, Andrew. Team, Peter advises that we've only had a limited number of responses to the call for evidence have been received, and that's probably owing to the limited timescale. Some potential respondents have asked for a little more time to make a submission. Are we content to extend the call for evidence for a few weeks in order to accommodate these potential respondents? I think we would be. Agreed? Yep. Is the committee content to publish the responses received to date on its webpage with a view to encouraging further submissions? I think we're agreed to that. Agreed. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, correspondence index, 10 items of correspondence on page 289. We're slacking, obviously, in the correspondence front. Okay. First of all, COVID support for travel agents. Members asked to consider page 289, response from the Department regarding financial support to travel agents. The Department advises that the Department for the Economy is responsible for this policy area. The correspondence was deferred from the last meeting. Pat, want to say anything?
No, that's fine. That's all you can do, is just take what's sent there.
Okay. So therefore, are we content to write the Department of Economy to seek an update on the uptake of the one-off grants payments offered under the Travel Agents Coronavirus Financial Assistance Scheme, and any further information on any COVID support schemes available to travel agents in Northern Ireland, since it sits with the Department of the Economy? Are we agreed, and would you be content with that, Pat? Yep. Issues faced by local airports. Members are asked to note at page 291 correspondence from the Committee to the Economy to the Minister for Finance highlighting airport issues raised, including the conversion of NIDACs. What is NIDACs? Northern Ireland Direct Air Compensation Scheme, I think, yeah. To a route development scheme and the ongoing union connectivity review. Are we content to note? Agreed, yep. Chancellor Spending Review. Members asked to note at page 294, Departmental Summary of the Spending Review. Minister will brief the committee on the budget and major policy challenges on the 17th of November. Are we content to note? Agreed. Budget process.
Chair, sorry, I think we have the older version.
I was talking about the older version?
Yes, with that one there. Sorry.
All right. Okay, allow me to. Where are we? Members asked to. Oh, sorry. Members asked to note page 294, a Departmental Summary on the Spending Review. Members are also asked to consider page 11 of tabled item, a written ministerial statement setting out more details of the quantum of the budget for the Spending Review 22-25, and including a breakdown and clarity on NDNA and confidence in supply money. Is the committee content to write to the Department to seek clarity as to whether the resource allocations include the projected increase associated with the change to national insurance? Because I haven't seen that within that. In respect to whether this Fresh Start capital will be used to cover the cost of the Strual campus, and whether any of this money has been lost to the Executive. On the capital funding packages and the FTC profile, and in respect to the NDNA transformation allocation, is this for health or education? Is it pay related? And on the student loan impairment profile. Are we agreed to those?
Yep.
Thank you very much indeed. And if we move swiftly on to 10.5, budget process executive collapse. Remember we asked the question of what would happen if the executive collapsed and when we're in the budget process? Members asked to note at page 298 a Department response to the Committee's request for clarity as to how the Minister would intend to undertake the budget development process and other associated legislative work in the absence of a functioning executive. Subject to the passage of the Northern Ireland Minister's Elections and Petitions Concern Bill, it appears that the budget consultation might be progressed as would the Budget Number 1 Bill in the event of an executive collapse.
That bill, members, is currently at second stage in the Lords. I think it's gone through the Commons already, but I'm not quite sure where it is now.
So basically, even if we don't have a First and Deputy First Ministers, we can go through to the Budget Number 1 Bill.
It would appear.
Okay. And maybe it might be useful for the members just to have a view of, within the Budget Number 1 Bill, what is the level of funding allocation they can make out to it, because I think it's...
So the Budget Number 1 Bill covers the spending that would happen in the current financial year. So they would be picking that up from, so they start with the main estimates back in May and then add on all the monitoring rounds. So it would be what the position would be. So if you look at the monitoring round at October, that's it, what the departments are left with. That, if I've understood the Minister correctly,
is it's always done in reverse. Yes. When we get the Budget Number 1 Bill, in fact, what we're doing is we're looking back.
Yes, that's all it does.
We content with that? Good, excellent. Monthly outturn and forecast outturn. Members are asked to consider page 302 analysis of the 2021 outturn and forecast outturn for September, including analysis of forecasting performance relating to the month of August. Is the committee content to forward this analysis to RAISE? Are we agreed? Agreed. Financial implications of climate change bill. Members are asked to consider page 323 correspondence from the Committee for Agriculture. Allow me just to add an extra piece on about climate change bill in just 1 second. Members are asked to consider at page 323 correspondence from the Committee of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs to the Minister for Finance, seeking commentary on the potential financial consequences of the climate change bills, including the likelihood of Barnett consequentials. I apologise to the committee. I should have made a declaration of interest.
That's why I was indicating.
I'm
the vice chair of that committee, and I'm also a co-sponsor of the
co-sponsor of the bill. Yeah, sorry. My apologies to the committee. I should have made that earlier on. Is the committee content to ask the Minister, when he briefs the committee on the 17th of November, to advise on the anticipated costs of climate change measures? Agreed. Building control fees consultation. Members are asked to note page 353, notice of a departmental consultation on proposals to amend the building prescribed fees regulation Northern Ireland 1997 and to increase fees by 17.5% in 22-23 and then a further 17.5% in 23-24. Pages 376 and 378 show the impact on building contractors. Are we content to note? Agreed. Sharing data with the EU. Members asked to note on page 407 a departmental response to committee queries indicating that the Department of Finance is unaware of any data incompatibility issues in respect to the sharing data by the UK and the EU. We content to note? Agreed. Economic survey. Members are asked to note at page 409 results of the latest Northern Ireland Chamber of Commerce and Industry BDO Economic Quarterly Survey. Is the committee content to note? Yep. Note and agreed. NISRA Registered General Annual Report. Members asked to note page 432 the annual report of the Registered General 2020 providing information on births, adoption, marriages and deaths and marriages in Northern Ireland. Are we content to note? Agreed. Yep. Written statement of 22-25 funding. Members are asked to consider at page 11 of tabled items.
Sorry, Chair, we've done that one. Sorry, mistake. Sorry.
Okay.
So we're just on to the composite request.
Members are to consider the composite request at page 465. Are we agreed? Great. Thank you. Draft forward work programme is at page 483. Are members content with the forward work programme?
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. And any other business? Thank you very much indeed. Team, next Wednesday, 10th of November, 1400 here in the Senate chamber. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, members.
Thank you.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound.